Picture a dark and draining world, where the typical adventure of a handsome but doomed protagonist unfolds. One who, under the cold rain, awaited his end. His eyes were lifeless and his body could barely move. And it was all because of the person standing right in front of him. She was a girl with silver hair and a beautiful figure. Though the most important thing was that she had her sword plunged into the dying man's chest. Yet, the man could hardly even feel hatred for her, for she was the most beautiful person he had ever seen in his life. Unfortunately for him, his destiny was always to fall under the sword of that beautiful woman. Damn, what a knockout. The half-dead man exclaims in his head. As it turned out, that woman's only option was to kill him in order to break their engagement. By the way, all of this is happening on the computer screen of our real protagonist, a video game programmer who spent days fixing that character's design. His name was W.O. Jain. He was a programmer at the prestigious company Ryuikai, a very famous one in South Korea. W.O. Jain was working on the company's masterpiece, a game into which they poured all of the company's resources. In other words, if the game was a failure, everyone would be out on the street. The company's idea for the game was for it to be extremely difficult, but at the same time, offer a unique experience to each player. The gaming community's feedback was heavily considered by the developers, and thanks to that, the game was filled with well-polished mechanics and a huge number of roles for players. They practically created a game where you could do whatever you wanted and be whoever you wanted. So WJN was sure the game would be a massive success. But for that same reason, there was a lot of pressure on the company's employees, as they had to options a ton of money, or a one-way ticket to the unemployment line. WOJN was especially concerned about this one character, named Dule von Gryen. He was the main character of a part of the story, and luckily, WOJN was able to fix all of his bugs. Dule von Gryen, one of the game's mid-bosses and a declared villain. His story could only end one way, dying under the sword of some hero. But for some reason there were many problems, and players were falling to him one after another. He had particular trouble with the route where his own fiancée ended up killing him. It was quite strange, but to WOJN it made sense. After all, that character had been through a lot. And then, this beautiful girl appears behind him. She was Yohara, and she was basically his boss. And on top of that, she was his ex-girlfriend. For 7 wonderful years, they shared their lives together and weren't really happy. However, WOJN was a world-class slacker, while Yohara was a workaholic. Thanks to his ex-girlfriend, WOJN got a job and became a more responsible man. He worked hard, but it wasn't enough for Yohara, and she ended up leaving him. Yohara tried so hard for WOJN, but in the end, it was all for nothing. 6 months had passed since they broke up, and it seemed Yohara had already found another guy. In any case, Yohara tells WOJN not to get distracted and to continue fixing the game's bugs. Although WOJN seemed a bit annoyed with her, since that character was quite weak despite being a mid-boss. To which Yohara explains that the character was designed that way, as how strong the villain becomes would depend on the player's choices. And here, Yohara drops a bombshell on WOJN. It seems that villain was directly inspired by him. And now that WOJN looks closer, he sees that they really do look alike. In fact, they look so similar that Yohara confesses that whenever she sees him in the game, she kills him immediately. Talk about being passive-aggressive. In any case, our protagonist was worried about the project, since depending on a single game was crazy. Although Yohara is optimistic, as the game's pre-sales were going very well and the reviews were also great. Regardless, WOJN could handle his work alone, and Yohara's handsome new boyfriend was waiting for her at the door. So WOJN tells her to leave the work to him and go be with her boyfriend. Something this girl, who I'm really starting to dislike now, does with a smile. As for WOJN, he stays in the office until late at night. As usual, he was still stuck on the Dule in character. Even the character's skills didn't seem to make sense, like child prodigy or average mage. It turns out that as a boy, Dule had awakened his mage powers and was called a child prodigy. But as he grew up, his magic didn't grow with him, and he remained just a sad, run-of-mill mage. Because he was adored as a child and despised as an adult, the character's personality turned into the worst thing you could ever deal with. In any case, the character was created to become stronger as the story progressed, since everyone around him hated his guts. Wojn felt that this character was too deep in the mud and wanted to add something to him, something that wasn't too flashy. And since they were supposed to be the same person, Wojn gave the character the understanding skill. Our protagonist was very empathetic with other people, so he added that to the character. But hold on, because he also decided he'd like to be rich, have perfect eyesight, have everything he did turn out perfectly, and so on and so on. And he went on like this for a while until Wojn realized he had gone way overboard with the character. So he prepared to reset the character and go to sleep. But, before that, one of the game's writers wanted to talk to him. Wojn asks if he wanted to change something about the character. But the writer didn't want any of that. Wojn did so and realized there was a strange storm over the building. One from which fierce bolts of lightning emerged, illuminating the dark night. And after that, confusion. Screams. Up, down, what's going on here? Wojn wonders. Listen to me carefully, son. The life that awaits you from now on will not be pretty. Subtitles made by the Amara org community. Be cautious and kill all your enemies. For such as Destined, the vilest villain to ever walk the earth. But for now, just wake up. Wake up already, you piece of scum, shouted a very angry girl. As you can imagine, Wojn had taken control of Destined's body. He had already spent several days in that body and still couldn't believe what was happening to him. The thing is, Destined was locked in his room because he was scared of a girl. And this angry girl was furious with him, as he was bringing shame upon the entire family. Wojn explains that after seeing the electrical storm at his company, he suddenly became Destined, one of the most vile villains in the video game. A week had already passed in that body, and although he didn't want to believe it, there was no doubt he was in the world of that video game. And on top of that, in the body of a not minus at minus all minus pleasant character, since he himself had been in charge of making his life as miserable as possible. Wojn was sure of one thing, no matter what happened. The reality was that he had become a villain who was destined to die. For a whole week, Deku spent his time locked in his bedroom, believing it was all a bad dream. But the more days that passed, the more his new reality terrified him. Wojn wasn't sure how he had gotten into this situation. But what he was sure of was that he had taken on the role of Destined von Gryan, a mediocre villain he was working on back in his world. The game itself gave all characters the opportunity to be whatever they wanted, but it was different with Deku. Absolutely everyone around him hated his guts and wanted the worst for him, so his only path was to become a villain. Worst of all, Wojn didn't know at what point in the story he was, but he was sure his end would come very soon. The character of Destined had been tested over 1,000 times, and he only managed to survive on one occasion. From the very beginning, Deku's character was designed to be a villain to be defeated. Beside him was his half-minus sister, Uriel, who acted as the head of the family instead of Deku. Of course, she hated her brother. Although she wasn't the worst. That would be Julie. Right now, Deku was a professor at the university and would have to act like one until he had more information. Deku was finally getting out of bed, and when he did, a floating text box appeared for him to read. A main quest appeared before him to become necessary to this world. To do so, he had to complete a side quest to give a lecture at the university. That didn't surprise Deku much. He was more interested in the reward for the side quest, as it would give him some very valuable coins for the shop. Normally, anyone would feel a bit worried about suddenly becoming a professor. But Deku possessed the understanding passive, which allowed him to understand any subject within his reach by using a bit of mana. Deku had added that skill thinking it referred to empathizing with other characters, but oh well. Details aside, that passive was obtained very late in the story, so it was very possible he would suffer side effects. Deku put on his character's best clothes. It was the first time Wojn had worn such expensive clothes, but with his passives, elegance and aesthetic sense, everything he wore fit him like a glove. That might sound fabulous. But the truth is, it felt like he was moving his body with strings from a distance. Even his mind had changed. Right now, he would normally be cursing, but instead he was perfectly calm. In this world, Wojn had become a handsome and elegant high-born noble. But deep down, he knew he was still a nobody, the one his beautiful girlfriend had kicked to the curb. Still, he wouldn't let his guard down. But he did so immediately upon getting into his luxurious carriage. It reminded him of his ex's new boyfriend and it pissed him off quite a bit. And then Deku realized someone was beside him. And who is this guy? The protagonist wonders. He must have been an assistant or something similar, as he handed him several documents. W.O. Jain was on his way to a lecture and thought he was being given information and such. But it was nothing like that. He was just handed a script that he had to recite word for word. That didn't surprise W.O. Jain either. After all, Deku was a talentless noble who only got where he was because of his parents' money. The boy next to him must have been the person who did all his work for him. So Deku thanks him and tells him to rest until his next job. Words that even surprised the driver. And of course, Deku's character was a total villain, and even his body felt wrong when he praised the boy next to him. W.O.J. could feel it. In any case, after a long journey, they arrived at the Imperial University. Where in the Roto Hall, the location of the lecture, Deku's impatient students were waiting. He enters the hall and quickly asks everyone to be seated, as his lecture was about to begin. Among the university girls, Professor Deku was greatly admired, as he was cold, manipulative, and handsome, just how women like them, no matter how much they deny it. Although among all of them, it seems one didn't think the same as her peers. Because Deku Elian was her father's sworn enemy, and now he was standing right in front of her as if nothing had happened. 3 years ago, her beloved father took his own life. Her father was a famous spell interpreter, one in the middle of his research. And the cause of his death was that Deku stole his research and ruined his life. Something our protagonist is obviously well aware of. In any case, the girl lost her father and her entire fortune, until she was left with nothing. And it was in this state of absolute misery that she swore to herself she would make Professor Deku pay. Shortly after, she managed to get into Deku's university and there, she joined his classes. And to her horror, Professor Deku recited her father's research word for word. Professor Deku was not only filthy scum, but he also had no shame and deserved to have a meteor fall on his head. In the girl's eyes, her father should have been in Professor Deku's position. The girl was enraged and wanted to jump on Deku's throat right there. But she had to be patient. She had to investigate Deku, get close to him, and then stab him where it hurts the most. Only then would her father rest in peace, and she would have her revenge. In any case, our protagonist Deku begins his magic class. There were 3 great attributes of magic and 9 types. The attributes were the element of magic, the components of magic, and the vessel of magic. On the other hand, the types of magic were invocation, destruction, enchantment, manipulation, ductility, and harmony. To Professor Deku's surprise, his speech was going wonderfully. It was the first time he had given a speech, especially in front of so many people. And he had no idea about magic, but still, his entire speech flowed smoothly from his mouth. Plus, he was able to understand everything perfectly on the first try, all thanks to his skill. In addition, Deku Elian had several passives related to being the center of attention, so all his students paid attention to his every word. Thinking about it a little more, Professor Deku's skills were pretty pathetic. But the truth is, they made him a magnificent teacher. His explanation continued, and now he explained the different cores of magic. For example, mages usually had their core in their head or brain, as it made it easier for them to use magic. On the other hand, warriors had their core near their heart, to make them stronger and braver. Then there were those who used an internal core, something like a mix of the 2 previous ones. What Deku wanted to get at with his explanation was that it didn't matter what you were or how you were born. If you studied and practiced, you could choose any path available to you. Something that applied to everyone except him, as his mana was only 3,375, even though he's supposed to be a mage. On the other hand, there were other characters who didn't even have names and easily surpassed 30,000 mana. The protagonist found it funny. His speech was about to end, but the last sentence threw him for a loop. If he were the original Deku, he wouldn't say the last sentence of his speech in a million years. But Deku musters his courage and asks his students if they understood everything, and that they could ask whatever they wanted. Luckily for the protagonist, none of his students seemed to have any questions. None except for the one who wanted his head on a pike, who shouted a question about a strange spell that had been seen in the dorms. "Let's see, who are you and why are you dressed like that in my class?" the protagonist asks. That girl wasn't following the school's rules, so Deku kindly asks her to get lost. And just like that, Professor Deku finishes his first lecture. It had been a complete success, but it cost him almost half of his mana to keep understanding activated. In any case, the rest of the students started making fun of the hooded girl for being weird, something that made her crave her revenge even more. The girl attacks again and says that there was something strange in the magic tower that no one wanted to investigate, and she asks her beloved professor to go investigate. The girl wanted to expose Deku's true talent, or lack thereof. So, using some magic, she showed Deku a spell and asked what it was. Deku analyzed the magic circle until he was almost out of mana, and immediately responds that the magic was a spell type, and to be more exact, it was for creating a barrier, surely to trap people inside or something similar. Deku hit the nail on the head and answered the girl's question, so she fell silent. Luckily for the protagonist, he successfully completed his first mission and received some coins. Now we go to the university cafeteria. There the girl from before was eating like a pig and cursing the protagonist non-stop. Her intention was to ridicule the professor with her newly created spell. But the guy goes and deciphers it in a matter of seconds, something that took her completely by surprise. Still, she noticed that Deku got nervous for a moment, so he was definitely hiding something. The magic she showed had suddenly appeared in the university dorms, and the girl wanted to catch Deku with it since not even she knew what it was. And then a girl arrives shouting Ippy Hirni's name, so we'll call her Luna. This girl was Luna's friend, and with Professor Deku's help, they discovered that the magic in the dorms was indeed a barrier spell. Everyone in the university was trapped by that magic circle, but because Luna dared to ask the handsome Deku a question, they solved the problem. Without intending to, Luna had now let the entire university know that Professor Deku deciphered a magic circle just by looking at it for a few seconds. And therefore, everyone admired him more than before. Luna sees inwardly and takes something from her bag. It was a letter with mysterious, very advanced magic circles. And with them, Luna planned to leave Professor Deku in the same misery as her, utterly ruined. Back to Deku. He was very relieved by how well things had turned out, as everything could have gone really wrong and left him in the mud. As I've said several times, Deku has no idea about magic or magic circles, but his understanding ability activated on its own. Luckily for him, he had just enough mana to analyze that spell. And really, Deku didn't fully understand that spell. I mean, he didn't know how it worked, how it was activated, and other details. The only thing he could figure out was that it was a barrier. It was like barely passing, but it was a pass nonetheless. And then Deku crossed paths with a very familiar person. White hair and blue eyes. It was the character he had seen thousands of times through his monitor. Her name was Julie von Frieden, and she asked Deku how he was doing. She was an extremely important character to the story, as she becomes a role model for all the Knights of the Empire. Of course, at this point in the story, she already hates Deku's guts. And if she didn't hate him already, it seems Deku broke a promise he made with her a week ago. What are you talking about now? Deku wonders in his head. So Deku just says that he forgot about it and was going to continue on his way as if nothing happened. But Julie plants herself in front of him and won't let him run away like he always does. Julie seems determined to get an answer out of Deku. So he tells Julie that he was actually very sick a few days ago and that he really doesn't remember the promise they made. Apparently, Julie wanted to give Deku a chance to be together, and all he had to do was confess his sins before everyone. Julie had been naive once again and trusted Deku, the one who betrayed her again, so she no longer expected anything from him. Fine, whatever, says the protagonist, who continues on his merry way, leaving his fiancée completely broken and even more furious with him, if that's even possible. The engagement between them was one of convenience. Deku Lien, in theory, was a talented mage, and Julie, a talented warrior. And whoever arranged the marriage couldn't have been happier about the union, since both families were high-class before, and now together they would become the most powerful family in the kingdom. At first, Julie was fine with the decision. After all, talent should be with talent. But then she discovered that Deku was actually a complete good minus for minus nothing and only had the titles he did because of his parents' money. However, Deku was so useless that his uselessness ended up reaching the press and so on. Still, both families wanted to unite to gain more power, so they tried to cover up the whole matter of Deku's uselessness. Deku was shielded by the power of his families, and now Julie would have to put up with a complete loser for the rest of her life. She could endure a loveless marriage, but she couldn't tolerate all the lies being told around her. So at one point, she stood up to Deku and told him that if he confessed all his wrongdoings, she would marry him without remorse and do everything possible to be happy with him. Something Deku agreed to do at the time, as he too was tired of his lies and wanted a better life. That of course made Julie very happy, as she thought she would end up with a good man after all. But in the end, it was all a lie. Once again, someone important to her lies to her face and does whatever they want. In any case, now they explain a bit about the Empire's magic tower. It functioned as a university within the game and was, of course, the best in that world. It was the equivalent of a real university, with students everywhere and professors explaining complicated things. The gardens were huge and everything was very well maintained. In fact, it was quite reminiscent of the American universities you see in movies. And well, it had to be that way since he and tons of colleagues gave their blood and sweat to make everything look perfect. So he's glad it turned out like this. Of course, WOJN would prefer to be in that world in the body of any other character. But the villain Eku is the one he got stuck with. And now he suddenly feels an attack from behind. So he lands a solid elbow on his assistant. The assistant falls on his back and apologizes for running near his professor. Deku thought it was an ambush to kill him, but luckily it was just his foxy assistant. But my name isn't Foxy, it's Alan. Who's Foxy? Asks Alan. The thing is, now in Deku's office, Alan gives Deku a list of mages. That university functioned almost like a real one, and they earned money by conducting private research and such. The thing is, one of the names on that list was written in golden letters. That was due to his passive skill, Wealthy Tycoon, which was practically an ultra instinct for business and money. And if he combined it with keen eye, he just had to follow the shines to find a good treasure. Deku was sure of it. Besides that one, there were others. But the one that shone the most belonged to someone we already know. It turned out to be EP here, ni Luna. And since Luna is prettier, we'll call her Luna from now on. She was one of the main characters of the game and someone Deku had to be very careful with. The thing is, Luna wasn't going to be given any money for research, which was actually normal, since Luna possessed considerable talent, and if they gave her money to do whatever she wanted, she could blow up the entire magic tower. Deku was in a great dilemma. It's not that Luna hated him. Besides, if Deku did things exactly as in the game, he would die for sure. And that was because he possessed the unique passive skill Villain's Fate, where your only path was death, but if you survived, you became stronger. In the game, Deku dies from countless causes, whether by a sword strike or a wand stabbed in his eye. He could end up poisoned by tap water, and if he walked down the street, a bomb could fall on him from the sky at any moment. There was only one thing clear in that world: his character would die a horrible death if he didn't do something about it. So Deku will take the action that the real Deku would never take. Deku's main goal was to get his hands on a mountain of gold, since most of his debts could be solved if he had enough money. Of course, having a mountain of money wasn't enough. That world was plagued with characters 1,000 times stronger than him, and all of them without exception wanted to cut off his head. If WOJN wanted to survive in that world, money wouldn't be enough. The only way for Deku to survive in that world was to be stronger than everyone else. In other words, he had to be number one. However, his skills, while useful for daily life, were very mediocre when it came to combat. The threats against him would be numerous, and he would practically live on the edge of death. Luckily, he had a very weak but very useful skill, manipulation of the elements, which practically gave him control over all the elements in the game. If you combine fire, earth, and metal, you got the Midas Touch ability, which unlocked the hidden power of objects within your reach. Deku was clear his character was a metal manipulator, one who used the weapons around him to inflict damage. Being able to manipulate floating swords might sound very spectacular, but the truth is that in that world, that was the most basic thing a mage could do. If the protagonist wanted real power, he had to develop his knowledge of magic. So he grabbed the biggest magic book he could find and prepared to consume it with his understanding ability. But as soon as he activated his ability, the entire room was flooded with magic. Lightning struck inside the room, and for a few seconds, even a tornado of magic shook the entire hall. Deku was in shock as all the knowledge from the magic book was slowly engraved into his mind. After a while, things calmed down, and Deku ended up in a pool of sweat. But in exchange, he gained better control over the objects around him. It might not sound like much, but what Deku wanted was to unlock the telekinesis ability, as with it, he could move anything, even if it wasn't metal. Of course, that basic spell was still not enough for Deku, and he had to get something strong if he really wanted to survive there. This isn't looking good at all, the protagonist says in his mind. But wait a moment, what if I use the magic circles directly on my body? In that world, if you drew a magic circle, the spell was greatly enhanced, and the larger the circle, the more power it gained. So Deku thinks of using telekinesis circles on his own body to enhance his spells. That should give him a lot of power, but his body might have a hard time. Luckily, he had the Iron Man passive, which made him immune to the side effects of training or negative effects. It wasn't much, but for now, he was the only one in the world with that combination of abilities. They seemed very useless in Work White Week, but if Deku understood his body better, he might be able to get more out of them. So the madman used his understanding on his own body, causing magic to flow through him. It was causing him a great deal of physical pain. But since he had started, he couldn't stop halfway, and the pain intensified so much that he could feel his body shattering into 1,000 pieces. Deku was enduring indescribable pain, yet his body remained impassive as if nothing affected him, all thanks to his poison-composed aura passives. But that's how a noble had to be. And he continued with his charade even when he was down to 1 mana point, feeling so tired that he thought he was going to faint standing up. But at least he got something good out of it, as he managed to create a powerful magic circle on his shoulder. And a month later, at the University of the Magic Tower, the professor was quite lazy and would just leave posters for the students with the class assignments. On that occasion, he asked the students to go outside and practice with elemental magic. It was the first official day of classes at the university, and the lazy Deku was already absent, which drove Luna crazy. But then a girl bumped into her. Luna turned around to confront her. But when she saw who it was, she was stunned. It was Sylvia von Josephine, an old acquaintance. But apparently she doesn't recognize Luna, so she continues on her way. Luna starts playing with her magic and can't believe she wasn't remembered. She belonged to the Iliad D family, and 10 years ago, they were the ones who threatened her father and stole everything. Her family was left in ruins, and Sylvia didn't even remember her name. And then her castle created with magic shattered into pieces. It was because Sylvia was accumulating all the mana in the area to build her own. Luna approached her and asked what she was doing, but Sylvia completely ignored her. This was really getting Luna heated, and she was about to beat her up. But then Luna realized something. There was no way Sylvia didn't recognize her. So now, with more curiosity, Luna asks why she's pretending not to know her. And she really wasn't pretending. Sylvia didn't know Luna. But she did know her useless father, the one who took himself out of the picture for being useless. "You've crossed the line," exclaims Luna, charging her fist with magic in great anger as she rushes forward. Sylvia got scared of her and created a barrier around herself. And it was a good thing she did, because the explosion Luna caused was enormous. So big, in fact, that it sent more than one student flying, and when the dust cloud dissipated, Luna was seen holding Sylvia's hair tightly, pinning her to the ground. Luna was threatening to kill Sylvia, when suddenly a huge dark sphere forms behind her. This scared all the students, as it looked like void magic. This happens when two types of magic collide, but don't completely cancel each other out. They continue to float in the air and begin to absorb everything around them. It was very dangerous and everyone had to get away, as it would create a huge explosion that would destroy everything in its path. If they didn't hurry, they would all end up dead in the void. Unfortunately, they didn't have much time to run, and the void sphere began to expand like crazy. Luna defended herself with her magic, knowing her end had come. But luckily for her, her end did not arrive. But the one who did arrive was Professor Aku, armed with thousands of crystals around him. Those ice shards were not created with the protagonist's magic. Instead, Deku had frozen the explosion itself and turned it into ice fragments. And he had achieved all of this using only telekinesis, something that left all his students amazed. It was enchantment magic, and it was so beautiful that none of the students could help but be dazzled by it. Until finally, the protagonist placed the last dangerous piece of magic on the ground. The class was over, and he wanted to have a very serious talk with Sylvia and Luna. And this is where my story ends, thanks poor Luna. I'm rooting for her, by the way. Sylvia is a real piece of work. Now we go to the interrogation room, where several university professors were gathered. As word echoed, the university president, Ada Lane. They were gathered there to punish whoever dared to attack the Grey Tilia D family. Although most of them didn't care about the issue. After all, Professor Deku solved everything without any casualties. The whole thing was a big charade, and the outcome of the meeting was clear. Sylvia was a high-minus class noble, and Luna was a fallen noble. So they would blame her for everything and move on. But how? This was the protagonist's perfect opportunity to drastically change something in the story, so he will help Luna. And he wasn't just doing it because she was looking at him with murderous eyes, though that was part of it, but because he really had to do it to survive. Thanks to his villain's fate passive, he could see with his own eyes anyone who was about to threaten his life. So if he fixed this issue with Luna, maybe she would calm down and not want to kill him. Of course, he wouldn't have it easy, because as soon as the hearing began, all the professors ganged up on Luna. She couldn't even respond and could only stand still while everyone called her useless and savage. The professors asked Luna why she attacked Sylvia, but she didn't want to say why, because if she did, Professor Deku would know she's Luna and that she's after him. Something he knows anyway, so. Seriously, I feel so bad for this girl. The reality is that Sylvia insulted her father, and in a pretty nasty way. But if she said her father's name, Professor Deku would have her in his sights. So she could only keep quiet, cry, and enjoy the storm. In fact, the professors were not nice to her at all and practically labeled her a psychopath. After all, she was a low-minus class noble. Since she wouldn't talk, Sylvia did. And she said that she accidentally destroyed Luna's castle and then Luna attacked her out of nowhere. She lied shamelessly. But absolutely no one argued with her in the slightest. In fact, it almost seemed like they wanted to put Luna on a pyre and set her on fire right away. It was just a disciplinary meeting. But still, dozens of people at her surrounded and were insulting her in every way possible. And they were all doing it because they knew she was an orphan and no one would stand up to defend her. Worst of all of this was happening because of the heartless Professor Deku. As the one she hates most in this world, the verdict was about to be decided. But then a deep and quite attractive voice asked Sylvia if she really was not at fault at all. This surprised both students as neither expected any rebuttal. In fact, even the professors asked Deku what he was doing. But Deku knew very well what he was doing, so he continued speaking. And he said that he thought Sylvia had great power and should have been able to stop Luna by herself. If she didn't, it's because maybe she was weaker than people thought. After some back and forth, Sylvia finally confesses that she didn't stop Luna because she wanted to get her in trouble on purpose, which obviously annoyed Luna quite a bit. Anyway, no matter how you look at it, it's really Luna's fault, so they shouldn't even be making a fuss. Indeed, it was Luna's fault, and I am the professor in charge of her, who lost sight of her. So the blame in reality lies with me, not Luna. This was driving Luna crazy, as she didn't understand what the villain Deku was plotting. But as strange as it seemed, it really looked like Professor Deku was taking her side. In the end, the university's headmaster gets tired of the issue. So she says it was just kids fighting during recess, so it was better to leave it to them. You're right, great teaching there. And just like that, Luna, who was about to be expelled, just got off with a don't do it again. Deku had made quite a scene, but his elegance was such that the other professors could only admire him for his poise. In any case, Luna calls out to Deku, and she yells at him, asking if he had forgotten about her and her father who killed himself because of him. Luna wasn't quite sure what she hoped to achieve by asking that. The only thing she could gain was Deku taking back what he said and getting her expelled at once. Still, she had to ask. Because if it turned out that Deku really had forgotten her and her father, it would be even more devastating. Deku replies that her question was stupid, and that she should leave the past behind and look towards a better future. It wasn't a very clear answer, but it was enough for Luna to understand that he did remember her. And in fact, he felt somewhat responsible. That's why he decided to help her on this occasion. Did he only help her out of pity? Or did he want to gloat over what was left of his past victim? Luna was a mess, but knowing that Deku remembers her and her father was enough for the moment. With that, the protagonist avoided his first possible assassination attempt, which earned him a couple of coins. Now we go to Sylvia and her wealthy family. She was telling the head of the family everything that had happened. And he asked Sylvia to leave Luna alone. After all, she was already in ruins. The history of those two goes way back. 10 years ago, both were subjected to a magical ritual. It was the typical ritual to determine a child's potential, and miraculously, Sylvia and Luna had the potential to become arch-mages of the Empire. Arch-mages were the mages who reached the eternal rank in magic. Their powers are immense, and they were even above the Emperor of the Empire. However, there was a catch. By tradition, there could only be 3 arch-mages living at the same time. One of those spots was already taken, and the second would soon be given to the headmaster of the Magic University. Therefore, only one vacancy remained, and both had to compete for the position. It was then that the Iliad family assaulted Luna's family and forced them to make Luna stop training and getting stronger. Sylvia was still too young to understand it back then, but all the misfortunes of Luna's family were her fault. And also that she alone could get the position of arch-mage. And yet, the miserable Luna dared to look at her with defiant eyes. Seriously, I dislike this girl more and more. The point is, the head of the family tells Sylvia to ignore Luna. After all, she was already out of the running and at this point couldn't catch up even if she started training. But the one she really needed to be careful of was Professor Deku. At that moment, no one had any proof, but everyone knew that Professor Deku was actually a textbook villain with multiple shady crimes under his belt. Something Luna already knew. After all, it was she herself who created the void sphere with her power. And in reality, Luna had nothing to do with it. Sylvia's magic was very powerful and strange, but still, Professor Deku cancelled it as if it were nothing. Deku knew perfectly well what Sylvia did, but instead of exposing her, he kept quiet about it and called it a draw. To Sylvia, it's as if Professor Deku already knew everything that was going to happen in advance and was telling her to her face that under his watch, nonsense wasn't tolerated. Sylvia thought Professor Deku was just another talker with a good combination of social skills, but it really seemed he was something more. A few days later, we go to the protagonist's mansion, where once again Professor Deku shows off a new outfit to look handsome. Deku was quite happy about having protected Luna, as it got him some coins, and it was possible that Luna would become more friendly. Whenever he sees her in class, his villain's fate screams like crazy, and he feels like he's about to die every second that passes. Of course, now it was possible that Sylvia hated him too. But it was something he had to do for Luna, no matter what. Deku would prefer to lock himself in his house and have zero social life. But he couldn't ignore his system's quests, and this time, it asked him to go to a New Year's party. To access the system's shop, he needed 5 coins, so he had to complete all the quests thrown at him. Deku arrives at the nobles' party and, as expected, there were great nobles of great fortune, plus a lot of security. There were a lot of famous people there. But the one who interested the protagonist the most was this blonde boy here. As it turns out, he helped design him. And then another of the nobles recognizes Professor Deku, which alerted all the nobles in the room, as Deku was quite famous in the upper classes. But then they asked him about a magic article he wrote a few years ago. Something that gave the protagonist a horrible stomachache all of a sudden, and he had to excuse himself. Deku moved away from the crowd, but then he heard the name Ganesha, an extremely important character in that world, one who even interacted with other players, so the protagonist had to ally himself with her and become her friend. But of course, the party hall was huge, and he was having a hard time finding her. Deku searched for Ganesha through all the rooms almost desperately. Meanwhile, without knowing it, he was being observed by the adventurer Ganesha herself, the 5th strongest character in this part of the story. Her gaze was so intense that it didn't take long for Deku to notice and look at her. Intense gaze, to read pigtails, and clothes that invited adventure. There was no doubt she was Ganesha, and Deku had to approach her as soon as possible. But before that, the character he noticed upon entering the party calls him over. His name was Helm, the 4th strongest person there, and he was a great imperial mage. Helm approaches Deku as if they were old friends who hadn't spoken in a long time. But nothing could be further from the truth, as Helm soon started mocking Deku for not publishing any new studies, or even finishing his last one. Deku and Helm were university classmates and were even friends, but upon graduation, Deku got the position of professor and Helm was left with nothing, so he held quite a grudge against him. The original Deku would get quite angry at the provocations of his old friend, but to him, it all seemed like childish squabbles, so he brushes it off. Hell mattered very little to Deku. But without realizing it, Ganesha had disappeared. And Helm kept throwing passive-aggressive insults, one after another, and Deku was about to punch the pest in the face. But they were at a civilized party. So, instead, Deku leans into his ear and whispers to Helm that if he doesn't shut up, he'll find him when he's asleep and slit his throat. Damn. And with those words, Deku continued his search for Ganesha, while Helm was left quite stunned. Because of Helm, the protagonist had lost sight of Ganesha and would now have big problems in the future. And the worst thing at that moment wasn't not finding Ganesha, but that all the nobles were looking for him to tell them about his research and so on. But suddenly, it was Ganesha herself who went looking for Deku. She approaches Deku and asks if he was looking for her. This confuses Deku a bit, as it seemed that Ganesha and Deku knew each other. And he honestly had no idea. Ganesha seemed like a pretty nice girl and asks Deku what he wanted from her. If Deku was looking for her because of her old job, she had already apologized and returned the money. So she asks Deku to forgive her for that time. Apparently, Deku had ordered Ganesha to get him some children with great magical power. Ganesha found those children but became so attached to them that she couldn't sell them now. Of course, the protagonist didn't know what they were talking about, but he could imagine it perfectly. Professor Deku was a textbook good minus for minus nothing, but since he had a great name and a great fortune, he acquired talent from outside and took credit for others' work, and he was surely planning to do the same before the body swap. Ganesha laughs in his face and asks him how much longer he planned to live like a parasite, a question the protagonist also asks himself. Woj possessed Deku's body with his story already well advanced. He let everyone applaud him for nonsense. But at home, his whole family hated his guts and wanted him to disappear. And not content with that, he had already ruined more than one family. And of course, he also lied to many people and played with the heart of one of the main characters. At that moment, Deku acknowledges that he has been scum, but from that moment on, he was going to change as much as possible. Something that obviously surprises Ganesha, who just hopes Deku isn't thinking of having her eliminated. Ganesha accepted a shady mission from a shady family, and not only did she not follow through in the end, but she also disappeared without a word. Ganesha really thought Deku was there to take her off the map. Something the original Deku would undoubtedly do. But Ganesha's actions didn't make sense, as she was so powerful she could perfectly destroy his entire family if she wanted to. Her main talents were invincible body and master of all techniques. With that combination, she was an unstoppable killing machine. Luckily for Ganesha, the protagonist reincarnated in Deku's body before finding out about her betrayal, because if not, it's possible he would have sent someone to kill her. His encounter with Ganesha wasn't what Deku expected, but at least he achieved his goal connecting with her a little. Deku leaves and tells Ganesha that she didn't have to worry about her mission and that he really wouldn't have her killed. Of course, Ganesha doubts it, but Deku assures her there will be no deaths on his part. Because killing others is in bad taste, says Deku. What is this man talking about now? Ganesha wonders. The protagonist was now in a position of advantage. He could pressure Ganesha with her failed mission and get her help, but if he did, he might trigger some other death variable. In any case, the system taunts the protagonist and congratulates him for overcoming another death variable, which terrified him completely. Deku hadn't even realized it, but while talking to Ganesha, he was on the verge of death, and he only survived by the divine grace of God. This left the protagonist in shock. Now we turn to Deku's fiancée and a relative of hers. Her friend wanted to have fun and dance, but Julie was more somber and sad. And it's no wonder she was. After all, Professor Deku was the vilest scum in the entire city. But don't say that so loud, because he's right behind you, says her friend. Deku Elien heard everything, obviously. But he just ignored Julie and left the party. Something that surprised all the guests, as Deku had a reputation for being a crazy party animal. But since Julie had just been saying rude things about him at that moment, rumors started spreading like wildfire. All the nobles believed that Deku and Julie were marrying for love, or at least that they liked each other. But after that, it became clear to everyone that they got along very badly. Unfortunately for Deku, he was unaware of any of this. He was just leaving the party to receive some mission coins. F for the fallen soldier. A week has passed since the New Year's party, and in that time, Deku had been training his physique. The reason was that he was about to die from lack of stamina. A few days ago, the protagonist had gotten cocky. He got overconfident because he gained some power thanks to his magic circle and tried to repeat it. He tried to add the fire element to his magic, as well as further strengthening his telekinesis spell. Thanks to his understanding, he could gain great power very quickly, but at a great physical cost. In fact, the magic's backlash was so brutal that he only survived because he had the iron passive. After that incident, Deku trained his body every second of free time he had. But it couldn't all be training. So we go to his office at the university, where he receives a letter from the Magic Tower administration. One that, before opening, Deku already knew would bring him a lot of trouble. Basically, they were asking Professor Deku to present some past study or research within 6 months. The nobles adored Deku, but the academics and intellectuals knew the truth about Deku and knew he was a good minus for minus nothing, so they wouldn't make it easy for him. Although that strikes Deku as a bit strange, since as far as he knows, his character Deku Lien is a professor at the university no matter what he does. And that could be bad for the protagonist, because if he were expelled from the university, he would have no idea what to do in that world. So Deku heads to his laboratory, hoping the original Deku already had something to show. And he did have something, but it was just a pile of junk and scrap heaped in a corner. That laboratory was new, but it had been unused for years. Therefore, the original Deku didn't even bother to hide it. But then he saw a book covered in trash, one that caught his attention. So using his telekinesis, he took the book and cleaned it in a second. To his surprise, inside the book was a locket with a picture of a young Luna. Luna's father worked for the original Deku several times before he was betrayed. So Luna's hatred for him must be very strong, since her father died for nothing, as his research was rotting in that laboratory. But all that was about to change. Deku will use his understanding to analyze all of Luna's father's research, and when he's done, he will give all the credit to Luna. Well, let's not get too carried away. He'll just say she helped with the research, which is already a lot. Deku was on thin ice, so much to his regret, he would have to take credit for that research. Now we go to the university cafeteria, where the few poor students of the university were chatting. There were barely 30 lower minus class students in the entire university, and they all had to stick together or the elite would crush them like flies. Although the only one who was truly poor there was Luna, since everyone else was unnoble, but she was the only one without a house or land. But the others didn't care about that. Sylvia was always showing off to the lower minus class nobles, so everyone greatly admired Luna for standing up to her. The lower minus class nobles wanted to create an exclusive club for themselves. But for that, they needed permission from one of the professors. For a while, they wondered which professor would want to help them. But almost all were high minus class nobles. But hold on everyone, because Luna's friend saw how Professor Deku helped Luna. So obviously, if Luna asked the professor for a favor, he might help them. In fact, one of the students thinks Deku might actually help them. After all, that professor hated everyone, regardless of how much money they had. In any case, they all held Professor Deku in very high regard, so they asked Luna to go talk to him. An idea that obviously doesn't sit well with Luna, since she wanted to kill him, not ask him for a favor. In the end, Luna runs out of the room shouting that she would never ask Professor Deku for a favor for anything in the world. But she was so distracted that she wasn't looking where she was going. So she barely avoids colliding with Professor Deku. Luna steps back and gets on guard before her sworn enemy. Meanwhile, her friend Julia completely sells her out and tells her to ask the professor for the favor. Professor Deku continues on his way, while Luna doesn't know what to do. In the end, she musters the courage and stands before Deku, and asks him to please sign the authorization to create a group. The university professors had to take charge of the groups they created, but Luna swears they won't bother him for anything in the world. Alright fine, says Deku, who takes the papers and signs them at once. He hands them to Luna and asks if she wanted anything else from him. But she was so in shock that she just stared at Professor Deku's signature. Well, I'm off then, says Deku, who leaves, leaving Luna more traumatized than before. Although her friend was very happy because they got a professor's signature, Luna didn't understand what was going through Professor Deku's mind. And above all, she wondered why he was being so nice to her. After that, Luna observed Professor Deku very closely in his classes. There were the options. Deku was helping her out of remorse or out of sympathy for her misery. In either case, the only thing it meant was that Deku knew very well what he did. and that he did horrible things to her and her father. And now he was trying to clear his conscience by being nice to her. Luna was getting sick just thinking about Deku, until her friend had to calm her down. Unfortunately for Luna, she not only had to watch out for Professor Deku, but also for her former friend Sylvia, who now just looked at her with disgust. Luna was surrounded by enemies, and if she made it to the end of the course alive, it would be a miracle. Although much to her chagrin, Luna was now actually enjoying Professor Deku's classes. In previous classes, it was as if the professor was just scribbling a pre-minus written text on the board. But now they were the complete opposite. Every day they learned something new. And Professor Deku's magic had become delicate and beautiful. And well, the protagonist was actually cheating a bit here, as he used his understanding to give mind-blowing explanations, which had his students enchanted. And the one who seemed most surprised was Sylvia. She was already much more powerful than the rest of the students, but Professor Deku's magic left her spellbound. On one occasion, Professor Deku fused a water magic circle with a fire one. The result was flames that moved like drops of water and floated around the room, something that left Sylvia in shock. Professor Deku's magic was not normal magic at all, but he explained it as if they were spells for preschoolers. A magic genius could perform any spell almost intuitively, but if they wanted to teach it to other students, it would be practically impossible, as it comes to them naturally and they didn't have to learn it in any way. That's why mages who dedicated themselves to following instructions ended up exactly the same, as if they were clones of each other. And that made sense. After all, learning magic was very expensive and took a lot of time. And it was better to achieve something mediocre than to end up with nothing. That was the contradiction of magic. On one hand, you wanted to develop it, but if you weren't a true genius, you would just wither away slowly. For a magic genius, it is practically impossible to explain a high-caliber spell. Yet there was Professor Deku, explaining highly elaborate spells in a way that everyone could understand. Subtitles made by the Amara or community. Professor Deku is continuously questioned about whether he is a true genius or not. But now that Sylvia saw him in person, she knows he is a genuine genius, and that everything else was just rumors from envious people. And Sylvia wasn't the only one who was impressed, as Luna couldn't miss a single word the professor said either. And everything was calm for her, until she reached the doors of her dormitory. And as usual, the high nobles of the university had left sweet messages for their classmate. Although not everything was bad, and there was something good under the door. A sponsorship certificate to support Luna with her studies. Luna bursts out laughing in hopes they don't think she's foolish enough to believe there was someone interested in her. Although forging documents was quite illegal. So Luna will report them to the police out of sheer spite. But then, upon arriving at the office, they told her the document was completely authentic. Luna couldn't believe it and even insisted several times for the clerk to look at it closely. But it was true. The certificate was authentic. There really was someone out there who had noticed her and wanted to help. Something so fantastic that even she couldn't believe it. But wait a moment, this was also bad. She had gotten a fortune and was showing it off as if it were nothing. So now she packs her bags to hide like a mad scientist. Her paranoia was growing. She even thinks the receptionist who gave her the check wanted to steal it. She was in twice the danger. And Luna was about to explode from the pressure of having so much money. In the end, she was so frantic that she ended up hitting her head against the wall. But that was a good thing, because Luna didn't wake up from the blow, which meant that there really was someone out there who wanted to support her. Luna couldn't believe it, and shedding tears, she hopes to meet whoever noticed her talent. But now she had no time for distractions and had to apply herself twice as hard to her research. Now we go to Deku's mansion. There his sister was a nervous wreck because she found out her dear brother went to a very prestigious auction. The last time Deku went to an auction, he threw away hundreds of millions of the family's money, and if he did it again, the family would be in deep trouble. Deku's sister was tearing her hair out over what her brother might do. Meanwhile, he was happy as a clam, spending some money without a care in the world. Deku had managed to unlock several unique powers, but due to his body's lack of talent, they were very weak. So the protagonist had to get rare materials and good equipment to compensate for his weakness. Deku enters the VIP room hoping to find something good there. And he did find something good, but not what he expected his dear and beloved fiancée. As soon as Julie sees him, she stands up with a very angry face. And without wasting a second, she heads towards him. Julie asks Deku if he was okay, but with a face and tone that made it clear to Deku that she hated his guts. Julie had heard that Professor Deku had held an exposure trial for 2 mages. She was referring to Sylvia and Luna. Professor Deku had a reputation for abusing talented students to steal their work, so Julie hopes Deku isn't planning to do the same to them. That was the last piece of advice Julie would give Professor Deku. After that, Julie would want to cut all ties with Deku. Something Deku eagerly awaited, because as beautiful as Julie was, she wasn't his type. Besides, he didn't want to get married at the moment. Moreover, absolutely everyone around him wanted him dead. So if he insisted on winning over Julie, he could end up stabbed at his own wedding. For them to separate and have nothing to do with each other was great for Deku. But Julie wasn't the type of person who went to auctions, so Deku was getting curious about her. So he asked Julie if she went there just to tell him about her students. This drove Julie crazy, as there was no way she would be so interested in the professor as to go looking for him. Julie's tantrum was colossal, but for some reason Deku found it super cute. In fact, it was the first time he had seen Julie with that kind of expression. Oh no, what's happening inside me? The real Deku's emotions were overriding Wojin's, and he unintentionally felt attracted to Julie. Luckily, it was only for a second, and Wojin calmed his inner Deku. The auction begins, while the protagonist hopes his heart doesn't start playing tricks on him. The first item of the auction was a vase created in the north with unique curves. In Deku's eyes, that object shone like the sun. It was all due to his wealthy tycoon ability, which could appraise the value of something just by looking at it. The price of the vase at the auction was exorbitant, and no one bid for it. No one except Deku, of course. The price of the vase was exorbitant, but it still shone in Deku's eyes, which meant that the vase was probably worth much more than that. For now, the protagonist had a lot of money in the bank, so he will try to multiply it like a crazy rich person. After the vase, the protagonist went completely crazy and bought everything that shone before his eyes. Deku was buying practically all the items in the auction, thus drawing the attention of all the nobles. Something that doesn't surprise Julie, as Professor Deku had a habit of throwing money around to get attention. In comparison to him, Julie was completely different, and she was only there looking for a truly beautiful object. More specifically, she was looking for the winter flame, which was the last item of the auction. A huge stone of flaming snow. Its pompous name was well minus deserved, as it was one of the 10 rarest metals in the world. That item was extremely good for creating powerful equipment, and the only things that surpassed it were fossils or bones of legendary creatures. For Deku, that object meant life or death in that world, but Julie wanted it at all costs. After a long battle, it seems Julie will get the object. But then Professor Deku brutally clipped her wings. Julie didn't understand what Deku was doing. Was he trying to provoke her? Did he hate her so much that he just wanted to mess with her? The noble next to the protagonist thinks he wants to buy the stone to give it to his girlfriend Julie. But he thinks it's better to let her buy it, otherwise she might get angry. Give what to him? What are you talking about? Deku asks, confused. The clueless Deku hadn't realized he had been bidding against his fiancée Julie the whole time. Subtitles made by the Amara.org community. You screwed up, man, Deku thinks to himself, but he still wanted the stone for himself. He felt sorry for Julie, but if he wanted to survive in that world, he couldn't be nice to anyone. But of course, Julie's look was screaming for blood, and Deku didn't need his ability to know that. But I don't care what looks they give me. That stone is mine, no matter what, Deku Elian declares proudly. The competition for the object continued, and as Deku promised, he got the prize gem. All the nobles in the room were amazed by the protagonist, as he took most of the items from the auction and even bought an expensive gem for his fiancée. This reached Julie's ears. And now she thinks that Professor Deku only bought the gem to look good in front of all the nobles, as he always does. Apparently, last year the original Deku bought almost the entire auction, just like this time, and then offered her all the items to prove he could get whatever he wanted. The original Deku seemed to have good intentions, but in Julie's eyes, it was as if he wanted to buy her with jewels and clothes. Deku offered beautiful jewels to Julie, but she felt so humiliated that she didn't even want to look him in the face. That day, Julie ignored everything Deku said or offered her. For her, it was clear that their engagement was going nowhere, but that wasn't the end. After that, Julie managed to rise to the top through her own efforts. But since she did it while already with Deku, Everyone thought Deku had pulled strings for her. Julie was forced by her family to marry Deku, but she had already decided that she would do whatever it takes to avoid that fate. Whatever she had to do. Back at the auction, Deku approaches his fiancée. And almost as if he were joking, he asks Julie if she really wanted the snow stone. A question so crude that Julie was about to explode with rage. It was very clear that Julie wanted that stone, so Deku apologizes for taking it from her. That apology took Julie a bit by surprise, and she was completely frozen. And by the time she realized it, Professor Deku was already gone, as he always is. In the end, she leaves the auction very confused about Deku, because as far as she can remember, she had never heard Deku apologize. In any case, outside the auction, her dear sister Josephine was waiting for her. Oh, fellow Deku, who was still regretting taking the stone from Julie, but for some reason his death alert didn't activate even once. In any case, Deku enters his mansion wondering to what point he had to push Julie for her to have no other choice but to run him through with a sword. Either way, that problem was for the future, because his beloved sister was waiting for him in his room. Apparently, the money Deku used was meant to buy mines for the war. Holy crap, is that why I had so much money? Deku wonders. Suddenly, Yeri starts screaming like crazy. She says her brother was the worst and that he only treated his sister like trash. Yeri sheds bitter tears and asks her brother how much longer he will keep her cleaning up his messes. Yeri, along with her entire family, was working very hard to keep the family afloat, but every time Deku could, he would throw a wrench in their plans. The money Deku used belonged to the whole family, and Deku had no right to use it as he pleased. Yeri was very angry with her brother, and the death alert was screaming like crazy for him to run. But there was something strange. Deku reached an impasse. Of course, there was no choice to be made. So Deku approaches his sister and tries to calm her down as best he can. Without much success, of course. Apparently, his sister Yeri had given up university to take his place as head of the family. And at her age, she hadn't even had a date with a boy or even friends to go out with. Yuri's hysteria was increasing, and her anger even more so Deku only had one option. Give his sister Yeri total authority over the family. That is, let her be the absolute head of the family, as if her brother didn't exist. That obviously left Yeri very stunned, and she quickly snapped out of her anger. Of course, she couldn't believe another one of her brother's lies. So for Yeri to believe him, they will make a magical pact, the typical blood pact that, if not fulfilled, would kill you on the spot. Yeri is still skeptical and wonders if her brother hit his head hard. Yeri suddenly switches to cute little TS under his sister mode and says if her dear brother didn't keep his word, she would kill him in his sleep. She said it. With everything clear, Yeri runs off to work. After all, thanks to Deku, they were back in the red. But thanks to that, Deku evaded death once more and got another pair of coins. Now everything was calm, but Deku feels as if he had gone through a hurricane in a swimsuit. But at least he had changed something drastic in the story, and if he continued on that path, he might even survive. And out of nowhere, Ganesha appears at the window. She heard the conversation between Deku and his sister, and it seems Deku was really changing, just as he said. Although Deku says it's not that he was changing. But then Ganesha drops a bombshell. Yeri didn't have a single drop of the Yuck-line family blood. A revelation that leaves the protagonist very stunned, as he doesn't remember seeing anything about that in the game. In case Deku hadn't gotten it, Ganesha repeats it. Yeri was not his sister and had no relation to the family. This left the protagonist a bit confused, because in the game, Yeri appears as a half-minus sister, meaning Deku already knew they were 100% siblings. But it turns out it's 0%. Yeri was a pretty important character in the game, and Deku should have known that kind of detail, but for some reason, it's the first time he's hearing about it. Although the thing is, the original Deku shouldn't be surprised by this, since he was the one who asked Ganesha to find out the truth. But anyway, it didn't matter. Uriel was his beloved sister, and she would continue to be. A declaration that surprises Ganesha quite a bit. But if it was okay with Deku, Ganesha will keep her mouth shut and make sure no one finds out the truth. Ganesha was about to leave, but before she does, she warns Deku that the 6 serpent heads were on the move. The 6 serpent heads were the leaders of the continent's corrupt organizations. They functioned as ultra-minus hard final bosses, and each of them had a bounty of several million. And apparently, those people had their eye on some of the items from the auction. So Ganesha tells the protagonist to be careful, as they might come after them. Ganesha disappears into thin air, leaving Deku with a major headache. To begin with, his treatment of his sister will remain the same. After all, he is not the original Deku, and Yuri was not his sister from the beginning. So at this point, it didn't matter what they told the protagonist, Yuri will be his sister until the end of the game. But for that to be the case, he had to make sure no one knew the truth. But now we go to Ganesha and her group on a mission in the forest. She was telling how Professor Deku had changed a lot and now seemed like a good person, but her companions think Ganesha just got swayed by a handsome face. In the group was this little one here, named Ray, and she was a relative of Julie, and she highly doubts that the villain Deku has really changed at all. But he had, because Ganesha wasn't even being asked to kidnap child slaves anymore. Oops, I shouldn't have said that. Please keep your mouth shut, says her friend. In any case, Ganesha had already said too much, so she asks everyone to be quiet. So we know how this will end. In any case, we go to the next day at the Magic University. There, Deku was a bit sad in his room. He had finally unlocked his shop where he could get mana upgrades and such, but unfortunately, he had no coins to use it. The game's shop system was quite special, as it not only allowed you to improve yourself, but also the members of your party. But there was a catch. The shop only appeared 6 times in the entire first half of the game, so you had to arrive well minus prepared. Using the shop system well was very important in the game, as it would mark the power difference with which you reach the end of the game. Deku had taken all his time to catch up on magic and magic circles. His training was going quite well, but his combat power was terrible, and if he fought against any enemy, he would end up on the ground. He had some time until the shop closed, and before that time came, Deku had to get at least 4 coins to become stronger. And then his assistant Alan arrives at the office. Apparently, a dangerous mage killer had appeared in the area, so he asks Professor Deku to be alert. His name was Lothar, and he was, so to speak, the first test for players, an enemy who massacred newbies without mercy. But Deku is not a player, but a villain like him, so in theory, he shouldn't worry. In fact, he even hopes to meet him for a villain -to- villain chat. In any case, Deku thanks Alan for his concern and sends him to rest, as it was late. But before that, Deku asks Alan if he planned to become a professor at some point, to which Alan replies that of course he did. Well then take this, and Deku gives Alan a bracelet with the family emblem. With that in his possession, it's as if Alan were practically a real professor. So Alan thanks Deku for the great favor. His assistant, Alan, was extremely effective in his work and in everything he did, and Deku had to make sure to keep him happy and by his side. Everyone who gets to know Professor Deku distances themselves from him immediately. However, Alan was still there. So for his good service, Deku also gives him a good tip. One so large that even Alan was taken aback by the amount. But that was the new Professor Deku, handing out wads of cash and making people happy. What a man, Alan thinks as he keeps his eyes on the protagonist's swagger. In any case, Deku now heads to the library. The reason is that Luna had developed a small research on the creation of elements, but it was full of flaws. So Deku went to the library hoping to fix them. But then Professor Deku saw something he didn't like one bit, and he started to curse in disgrace. The troublemaker Sylvia was where she shouldn't be, as that area was only permitted for professors. Rewind 10 minutes, and apparently Sylvia wanted to see some books that were out of her reach. But you know, she's the spoiled child of the Iliad family. So one of the professors broke the rules and let the girl do whatever she wanted. Apparently there were some novels written in the fairy language. Fairies had gone extinct a long time ago, so their books were very valuable and well protected. But thanks to the Iliad family's connections, Sylvia was able to reach something that was beyond her reach. Although she didn't think she would run into Professor Deku, who almost died of fear just from seeing his face. Sylvia is surprised, because as far as she knows, Professor Deku wouldn't touch a book with a 10-foot pole. But what Professor Deku liked was none of her business, so Sylvia explains that she was given permission to be there. But Deku wasn't amused. The rules of the Magic Tower were there for a reason. So he will find the professor who gave her permission and give him a piece of his mind. And then Deku noticed Sylvia's book. That book was a kind of romance story, written in fairy language, which surprises Deku quite a bit, but it surprises Sylvia even more that Deku can read fairy. Subtitles made by the Amara org community. The point is, That book was a good book, so for this one time, Professor Deku will let it slide. Professor Deku leaves, but he warns Sylvia not to overuse her family's power, or he himself will put a stop to it. Deku leaves like a total Giga Chad, making things crystal clear with Sylvia. And once again, Sylvia feels humiliated and baffled. She just wanted to spend some time reading a good book. But instead, she ended up being scolded by Professor Deku, who on top of that, could read dead languages. Now professors and students go to the forest. It was the first practical training the students would have, and everyone was euphoric. They were on the Dark Mountain, a place near the city and very important to the kingdom. Not only were new recruits trained there, but it was also a source of rare materials. Of course, over the years and by keeping it closed off, countless creatures of all kinds emerged in the area. But that was a good thing, as it gave them more to practice with. In any case, one of the professors had to lead the students, something Professor Deku immediately volunteers for. But not because he wanted to be a good professor, but because one of his missions sent him there. And not only that, but he also felt as if something dark was calling to him. Everything seemed calm, but if his system sent him there, it meant something big was about to happen. But 9 hours later, in a pastry shop in the Magic Tower, Luna was about to enjoy an iced dessert, as it was the first time she had some money to spend. With her were her lower minus classmates, discussing how to organize their room and attract more students. They were also talking about an incident in the Dark Mountains, but Luna was more focused on her dessert, so she ignored it, until an intense magic alerts everyone present. It was very strange, and everyone stood up at once to see what was happening. The magic came from a distant place, and as they got closer, they heard cries for help. Luna led the way, and her friend Julia tried to stop her, as she felt something very strange in the area. But it was too late. Without understanding how, Luna was now completely alone. But not entirely, as the cries for help were getting louder. After a while of searching, Luna found a woman half-minus crawling on the ground. She ran to help her, but then a lot of blood fell on her, as someone was attacking that woman from behind, literally tearing her to shreds. Luna gets on guard and looks everywhere for the person responsible for the attacks. She didn't have to look far as Professor Deku appeared right behind her, using his telekinesis. Luna panics and asks Professor Deku what was going through his head. "What's going through my head is that you, my dear friend, are a bit of an idiot and almost got eaten," replies Professor Deku, as that woman was actually a deformed and enormous beast, red with horns and everything. The beast was hideous, something Luna had never seen even in books. Deku had no time for Luna, so he grabs her by the neck and throws her far away from the battlefield. Deku gets on guard and prepares to begin his first hunt. The enemy was furious, as it had a victim right in front of it and had lost it just like that. The demon attacked head-minus on and with force, while Deku used his telekinesis to stay away from it. The demon was persistent, to the point that Deku had to protect himself with all his power. A life minus or minus death situation that Deku was not enjoying at all. Luckily for Deku, the demon specialized in illusions and its physical power was quite low. But the important thing here is that the enemy is a demon, which activated the unique ability of his U-Claw and bloodline, which basically turned his entire family into demon hunters. But in doing so, he could go a little crazy. That racial trait was due to an ancient family tradition, as it seems they always had a good time hunting demons. A thirst for demon blood that also affected Deku himself. Was it rage or bloodlust? Deku wasn't sure what he felt towards that creature. But he knew one thing: he could crush its skull with his finger. Just a little bit of force. And in fact, that's what he did. That made Deku complete several missions, as well as unlocking his family's passive. But that wasn't all, as the appearance of the first demon meant that the game's story was about to begin. Or in that world, it would be more like the beginning of the world without a player. But for now, let's go back to Luna, who wakes up suddenly, startled in her bed. Apparently, as soon as she saw the demon up close, Luna fainted. To make it clear, the nurse tells her that Professor Deku defeated the demon and that thanks to him she was alive. Again, thanks Luna. However, Luna hadn't been unconscious for just a few hours. She had been in a coma for almost a whole day. And that was very bad. Because of that, she would be late for her university classes. Luckily, her legs were nimble, and she arrived just in time. There was her friend Julia, who was immediately happy to see that her friend Luna was okay. However, in that class, something seemed different, as there were several plates with materials distributed around the room. And then Professor Deku and his assistant Alan enter the room. Alan was not usually seen by anyone, so practically no one in the room knew who he was. So Professor Deku introduces him as Alan and says he will be his class assistant from that day on. This surprised all the students, as Professor Deku always did everything himself without anyone's help. For people without money, becoming a professor was an ordeal. That's exactly what happened to Luna's father, who, even after turning 30, couldn't get a job as a professor. If you became a professor's assistant, you could beef up your resume and thus become a professor much sooner. And for that very reason, Luna's father worked for Deku for a very long time. However, Professor Deku never gave her father a chance to shine, but now he gives one to an unknown kid. In any case, Alan distributes several elements and starts the class. The only thing Luna had left of her father was a small bracelet that she never took off. Her father gave everything to work with the great Professor Deku at Lien, and after many years of service, he never named him an assistant. Luna's task was quite simple, and she had to create a small spell, but her mind was so saturated with bad thoughts that it wouldn't let her think. And then, 20 minutes into the class, Sylvia had already completed all the exercises, and her table was overflowing with elemental magic. Deku and Sylvia exchanged shady glances, but she had completed the exercise, so Sylvia could leave if she wanted. That made her quite happy, and she immediately looked at Luna with an air of superiority. Sylvia leaves triumphantly, while Luna remains with her resentful friend. Time passed, and little by little, all the students in the class completed Professor Deku's exercises. All except Luna, who stayed in class until it got dark. It was all over. She was a total failure, and her mind was so saturated, it wouldn't let her think about anything other than Professor Deku. In the end, Luna was left alone in the classroom and wonders why she was so pathetic. But let's remember that Luna's entire childhood was sabotaged. She didn't go to school or high school and entered the university directly, barely passing. She simply couldn't compete with her classmates. In any case, 6 hours have passed since Professor Deku's class began, and he would like to go home before the new year. But wait a moment, Luna wonders, why is Deku waiting there? Deku scolds Luna because her exercise was quite easy, and she was the only one who didn't complete it, something she regrets very much. Deku tells Luna that it didn't matter how sad she was, whether a classmate betrays her or she's facing the very person who killed her father. Luna would only manage to get ahead. To Deku, Luna had a very weak mind, and if she continued like this, she would never, ever be able to do anything to him. Deku feels very disappointed in Luna, as he thought he and she were somewhat similar, but what she was showing him made it clear that they weren't. Deku left the classroom, leaving Luna alone, and she returns to her seat, and with pure rage in her heart she returns to her spell. Professor Deku was disappointed in her, and who cares about that? Luna wonders. It didn't matter what it cost Luna in life. In the end, she will obtain a power superior to all and then take revenge on everyone who ever hurt her. No matter what happens, she will fulfill her revenge at any cost. From outside the room, Professor Deku observed his student. He didn't like to do things the hard way, but he really needs Luna to become much more powerful for what is to come. Thanks to the demon's warning the other day, the protagonist was sure that the main quest would begin soon. When it begins, the characters of good will unite against those of the shadows, and Luna had to be among the strongest in that group. But for now, she was far from that, as she was very weak mentally and completely lacked magical power. But let no one be mistaken, Luna was 1,000 times more powerful than Professor Deku, and if he wasn't careful, she would create a bomb that would explode in his face. After a while, Luna leaves the classroom, slamming the door. She just ignores Professor Deku and leaves the place without a word. So, Deku entered the classroom curiously, and he could confirm that after 6.5 hours, Luna finally completed her exercise. Luna's case was quite sad, as everything she did showed that she didn't go to school or even have an education. However, if you took that into account, she had brought herself up to the level of her classmates in many subjects on her own, which made her quite brilliant. Luna's case was closed for now, so Deku goes to rest. But before he does, he is stopped by a man. It was a man in a white suit, quite happy to see Deku, as it had been a long time since they had seen each other. What is this pest doing here now? Deku wonders. He was Ito von Frieden, head of the Frieden family and Julie's older brother. He was the current head of the family and also the one who imposed their marriage on Deku and Julie. But let's not just focus on this family name. As it turns out, he was stronger than Ganesha, making him the third strongest person there. This guy was a heavyweight, and Deku wonders what he wants from him. Does he want the snow stone for his sister, the one I stole right in front of her? If so, he would be in serious trouble, as he wouldn't give up the stone for anything in the world. The thing is, Ito had heard that Deku and his sister were getting along very badly, so he went to see what was happening. For now, Zito was friendly, so Deku will play along as much as he can. An attitude that Zito loved, as it meant they wouldn't waste time on nonsense, so they will hold a grand dinner to reconcile the lovers. So be good until then, says Zito, and leaves with a smile on his face. Everything seemed to go well, but Zito certainly had Deku by the balls. Zito valued his family and power above all else, and if Deku did something foolish, he could make a powerful enemy. The next day, Julie was informed that she would be having dinner with her fiancé. Something she immediately opposed, as she hates him and he hates her. Zito tells his sister not to be so spoiled. After all, she was making a big fuss over just an auction stone. Of course, it wasn't just about the snow stone, and Julie argued heatedly with her brother. Zito says the snow stone was only useful for making powerful equipment, and Professor Deku didn't use anything for combat. So it was most likely he was creating something beautiful to give to his precious Julie. But the thing is, if Professor Deku were to give her a sword made with the snow stone, Julie would get 1,000 times angrier with him. This no longer made any sense, and her brother was losing his patience with her. So he gets very serious with his sister and asks her to stop being a spoiled brat. But Zito is understanding, so if his sister was in love with another man, he could understand. But the thing is, Julie lived for him by fighting, so she didn't have any secret romance. Zito asks Julie if she hates Deku because of the rumors that he is a villain and so on, but she assures him it wasn't just for that. It was because of the promise the original Deku made and the current Deku broke. But her brother didn't care about that and expects his sister Julie to look beautiful for the dinner. In the end, Julie was left alone, unable to say a word. Such was her helplessness that she couldn't help but draw her steel. Thrust after thrust, slashes in the air, was the only thing Julie could do to vent her fury. And although it might seem like a simple tantrum, don't trust this girl, as her inner power was enormous, which is why she was the captain of the knights. And then someone appeared behind her and tried to calm her down. It was her loyal subordinate Varen. Julie feels ashamed to show something so embarrassing to someone so close to her. But she shouldn't feel that way, because Varen thought the same. No matter how you looked at it. Professor Deku wasn't even worthy to lick Julie's boots, and they had to break the engagement at any cost. But Julie tells him to be quiet, as neither of them had the power to decide their futures. Still, she looked at Varen with tender eyes and asked him not to worry about her. At that moment, something clicked inside Varen. Julie was an extremely valuable person to him, and also unique. He swore years ago that if he saw her suffer or feel anguish over something, he would help her no matter the price. It seems that moment had arrived, and it was in his hands to put an end to Julie's misery. Whatever he has to do, he will perform any shady act for the happiness of his lady. Now we go to a meeting of elderly mages. The reason the appearance of the vile demons. Initially, magic was developed in that world to fight against demons. And now that they had returned, the 12 great mages had to unite to fight. But first, let's go back to the protagonist. After many days, he managed to organize the items from the auction. The jewels especially were very valuable, as they also served as magical equipment. Everything was fine except for the most important thing. It seems Deku couldn't do anything with the snow stone. He already knew he couldn't get the most out of it at this point in the story, but he couldn't even lift it with his telekinesis. The stone's own mana was stronger than the protagonist's, so when it got close to it, it was completely nullified. This was crushing the protagonist's soul, for many reasons. But then he remembered reading in a book about mastering swords or entering into communion with them. It was vague, but maybe with understanding, Deku could get something out of the rock. So Deku placed his hand on the rock and used understanding. But alas, using 2,000 mana points, he only understood 0.1% of the rock. If he did it that way, it would take him more than a year to analyze the entire stone. So, on to the next thing. And the next thing was not pleasant at all, as it was now time for dinner with his lovely fiancée. So we go to the Von Masher restaurant. There, he is quickly greeted by Zito, and together they look for Julie. To Deku's surprise, it was the first time he had seen her in a dress, and she looked truly beautiful. Since she always wears armor, Deku hadn't noticed, but besides being beautiful, she had nice curves. Without a doubt, Julie was very beautiful, and it was no surprise to the protagonist that the original Deku was in love with her. Deku sits at the table and was so fascinated by Julie's beauty that he didn't realize there was another person at the table. Julie's dear and beautiful sister, Josephine. But let no one be fooled. In reality, she is a textbook psychopath. She ran a large criminal organization from the shadows, and although she hid her power, she was actually as strong as or stronger than Zito. When Deku says Josephine is a psychopath, he's not saying it lightly. She only loved her sister Julie above all else, and if you bothered her in the slightest, her sister would make you disappear from the map. At this point, Deku had already messed up quite a bit with Julie, and the fact that Josephine hadn't killed him yet was a miracle. But as soon as he thought it, his death alert started beeping, and Josephine's dark orb began to surround the entire room. Deku's life was hanging by a thread, so he would have to convince Josephine that he really loved Julie. In any case, Zito immediately asks about the wedding date, a question that annoyed Julie quite a bit. But the men were talking, so Zito tells her to be quiet. Deku seems to want to say something, not without being able to avoid seeing Josephine murdering him with her gaze. Deku tries to be a gentleman and says he will only marry Julie if she wants to. An answer that Julie didn't seem to like at all. Aito is displeased to hear that, as the family elders had already decided they would marry no matter what, and going against them would be bitter for everyone. In the end, Julie gets tired of having no say and shouts with great force. Although she was just a bit nervous and asks to speak with Professor Deku alone for a moment. Josephine and Zito leave the room, leaving Julie alone with Deku. Deku wonders what Julie wants to tell him alone. Although her look didn't say she wanted to talk, but rather to stab him directly in the neck. Julie calms down a bit and asks Deku what he really wanted from her. Although Deku wasn't sure what to answer, as her sister Josephine was listening behind the door. With a murderous aura so strong it even passed through the door. So Deku had to be very careful with his words. Although this could be an opportunity. Josephine doesn't know that Deku knows about her other identity, so he could put on the performance of his life. To survive, he didn't have to convince Julie to marry him, but his sister Josephine that he loves Julie. In any case, the engagement between them had to be forced, and Deku was looking for a way to break it. This, of course, did not please Julie at all, as it was Deku himself who arranged the whole matter of their engagement and assured the elders of both families that there would be great benefits. And the worst of it wasn't that, but that the original Deku told Julie that fighting was dangerous. So he used his contacts to get Julie off the battlefield, which is why she was now stuck in a captain's post in the city. And the worst part is that when Julie wanted to return to the battlefield, Deku used his contacts to tarnish her reputation so she wouldn't be hired again. Julie was sure of it. Deku just wanted to torture her and see her suffer. Deku was well aware of what the original Deku did, so he really couldn't answer anything, as he knows very well how he destroyed Julie's life little by little. For that reason, the protagonist could empathize with Julie and knew perfectly well that he was the worst. That's why Deku promises never to do that kind of thing again, something Julie obviously can't believe. Deku acknowledges that he did the unthinkable just to have her by his side, something that surprised Julie. But let's not get crazy, as Zito and Josephine also did everything possible for them to get married. In fact, if it weren't for them right now, Julie and Deku would go their separate ways and be done with it. In any case, didn't you want to be a defender? Deku asks. The title of defender was given to the greatest knights in the kingdom. They served no family and were free as the wind. But that was a secret of Julie's that she hadn't told anyone. In any case, Deku says he really doesn't care about anything, and if he could, he would go to a deserted island and forget about everything. It was clear that Professor Deku was not a good man for the beautiful Julie, but due to his machinations, they can't break the engagement, so they'll do something else. They'll stay engaged but never get married. Julie could use Deku's surname as much as she wanted, regardless of her family. And when Julie feels ready to pursue her dream again, Deku will leave the doors as open as he can for her. That seemed too good to be true. And surely Professor Deku planned to charge Julie a high price for such a favor. And really, Deku didn't want to ask for anything in return. But if he had to ask for something, Deku would be content with seeing Julie's smile once a month. A request that obviously left Julie in shock and bright red. More or less the same thing that happened to her sister who was eavesdropping. But let's not be confused. Deku was being extremely calculated with his words, and it was all so that Josephine wouldn't kill him from behind. But for some reason, Julie's attitude had now completely changed, and she was the most adorable thing the protagonist had ever seen in his life. At this point, Wojn could no longer deny it. The love that the original Deku felt for Julie had now become his own. In any case, Julie makes it very clear that they will never marry or do anything as a couple. Something Deku accepts and just lets out a few laughs. This annoyed Julie a little, but it seems Josephine finally saw Deku in a good light. Luckily for Deku, he had dodged a huge bullet, and thanks to that, he got another pair of coins. The dinner ends without complications, and 3 days later, Deku was heading to the anniversary of his death. And for that, he enters the city cemetery. That ceremony had nothing to do with that world, or anything like it. Not even something related to Deku's character, but it was the anniversary of the death of Wojn's best memories. It all happened on a random work night. He and his ex-girlfriend were working on the background of Deku's character. His ex-girlfriend Yohara was very excited, but Wojn didn't want any more extra work. Still, she insisted a lot and with a big smile says that games made with love were more cherished. But in the end, Wojn couldn't be bothered to do the extra work. So Yohara, who was very stubborn, ended up creating a hidden Easter egg on her own. Wojn's mind was a mess, and he needed a change. He needed something from his old world to remember who he is. So he found the Easter egg his ex-girlfriend created, and it turns out that the character of Deku Elian had a deceased former fiancé. And that fiancé's name was Yohara, his ex-girlfriend's name. Deku doesn't understand if it's a joke or a rather cruel prank, because why would she put her name on the grave of the ex-fiancé of the character inspired by him? And the worst part was a phrase on the headstone, "Always grateful to you." Deku doesn't understand anything and just touches the headstone. And unable to stop himself, he begins to shed tears on the headstone. Which was partly normal because for him, not only had his ex-girlfriend died, but all his family, friends, and acquaintances as well. Wojn and his ex-girlfriend, Yohara, spent more than 7 years together in a fantastic relationship. That was like a dream for Wojn, but all of that was now in the distant past. And after a few minutes, Deku stopped crying and in just a few seconds, he was perfectly composed again, as if he had never cried in his life. But then he was assaulted by someone who seemed familiar. And he certainly looked familiar, as it was the mage hunter Lothar, the first enemy of the game. He seemed to be out of his mind and only thought about killing arrogant mages. Lothar was a mini-minus boss that only mage classes could face, the reason. He is immune to magic. Lothar attacked head-on, and Deku threw a bunch of rocks at him. But as he expected, when his magic got close to Lothar, it simply vanished. As for Lothar, he attacked relentlessly with a large blade. His movements were agile and swift, but Deku seemed to be able to handle him. At one point, Lothar jumped on Deku, and with his knife, he was going to massacre another cheap mage. But instead, he got a solid punch to the teeth. One that made him fall to the ground and made it clear that Deku is the one in charge there. A few days ago, Deku finally got 10 shop coins. With them, he bought a mana manipulation upgrade, something he thought would help with his magic. However, that upgrade turned out to be much better than expected, as it didn't just affect his magic, but his entire body and magic circuits. So at that point, without Deku having realized it, he had become something like a superhuman. The thing is, with that victory, Deku evaded death once again, so he got another pair of coins. Deku didn't really need to use power to defeat Lothar. After all, if you trained physically, you could defeat him easily. But Deku wanted to test his new power, as he still couldn't fully regulate it. As for Lothar, he was very angry with all mages because without magic, they were completely useless, and when the end comes, no one will know how to do anything. And then Deku realized something he had overlooked. Lothar seemed to be a member of the Blood Ribbon race. Something that stunned Lothar, as there was no way he could have known about them. The name of the Blood Ribbon race came from the fact that at birth, They came out covered in a strange red membrane and were also descendants of demons. Generally, they lived their lives hiding their identity and could be said to be the opposite of mages. Magic was created to fight against demons, so the struggle between mages and the Blood Ribbons was very old and central to the story of that game. In other words, everything related to the Blood Ribbons belonged to the main theme of the game. And that was because they were in danger from the moment they were born, just for being born the way they were. In fact, at that very moment, a purge of Blood Ribbons was supposed to be taking place, where they go house to house killing demon children. Deku tells Lothar that he was on his side and that the slaughter of the Blood Ribbons was a disgrace to humans. Deku asks Lothar not to kill any more mages, because otherwise, he would be exactly like them, something Lothar obviously doesn't agree with. But that was the least of it. Deku knew that the entire race of Blood Ribbons was innocent of any wrongdoing. Although Lothar didn't understand anything Deku was saying and just asked for a quick death. But Deku only killed if he lost his temper, and the only time that happened was when he fought the last demon, and that was because he belongs to the Yu-Clawin family, one of the first families to hunt demons, so when he saw one or something similar, his blood clouded his judgment. However, with Lothar, nothing like that happened, and he saw him in the same way as a normal human. To make it clear, Deku says that if the Blood Ribbons had anything to do with demons, Deku would have already disemboweled him. But he hadn't, which meant that Lothar was as human as the rest of the world. And then more people arrived, hearing the commotion, and Deku asks Lothar to trust him, and immediately kicks him in the face with the force of a lifetime. Lothar was still a mage killer, so his place was in jail. But, before handing him over to the police, Deku uses his telekinesis on the stones and dust of the place, and with it, creates a steel rope that he hands to the policeman. Lothar dissolved magic, so it was better to have him tied up with something very strong. With everything clear, the guard thanks Deku Lin for calling the police, which strikes him as odd since he didn't call anyone. In any case, everything was sorted out there, so Deku continues on his way. Deku leaves the place quite satisfied. He would have hated himself if he had killed someone at the grave of his memories. And the next day, at the mansion of Deku's family, he was spending his time training, so his sister had to act as his mail carrier. But the role of the head of the family was to take care of the whole family, so now she couldn't complain. Subtitles made by the Amara org community. The thing is, since demons and dangerous people had appeared on the streets, the script has turned into a horror game. The great mage Bert has called a large meeting, which for Deku translates to the main quest. Subtitles made by the Amara org community. The meeting will be in a week, and Deku Lin should go accompanied by a guard. Iriel suggests asking her servant Jeff, since he is a former mercenary, but Deku Lin says it won't be necessary. Especially not Jeff, since he's been away from battle for so long that now he's nothing more than a chauffeur. Still, Uriel didn't want to leave Deku Lin alone. Even if it was just a meeting, there was a reason they asked him to bring a guard. Deku Lin is surprised to see his sister worried about him. But it didn't matter what he said to make her blush. Deku Lin will go with a guard. And that's final, says his sister. Besides, she isn't officially the head of the family yet, so if Deku Lin died, they'd all be screwed. And now we shift to the training office of the Freyhem family, Julie's family, where Julie was training her men with great diligence. And behind her, what appears to be a servant worried about her. Further behind him was Varen, Julie's loyal subordinate, who was so stealthy he startled his companion. Apparently, the order had been entrusted with a very important matter. But for some reason, they didn't want to tell the captain. There were several reasons, but the most important one. In theory, they are going to escort an entire train, but what's important is who's inside Deku Lin. Varen saw his opportunity in this mission, so he asked his partner to accept the mission immediately. Of course, they weren't doing it for nothing. Train escort missions grant a huge amount of prestige, and if they succeeded, they would make a good name for themselves among all the nobles. That convinced the guys it made a lot of sense, so he ran to the captain to inform her of their new mission. "I'm coming for you, Professor Deku Lin. I hope you're prepared," Varen says, sinister lie. Berkti was the name given to the highest mountains in the world, a place of magic and wisdom, and for that reason, it was the home of the kingdom's mages and wise elders. That place made decisions related to magic, which in turn affected the entire world. As you can imagine, this place was no joke. Meetings were only convened once every few decades. So being invited to a meeting was a tremendous honor for the entire family. Or at least that would be the case for anyone else. For everyone except Qlen, of course. Since that place was also known as the Tomb of Mages. Now we go to the Birkti train station. There Julie, along with Varen and her guard warriors, awaited their client the elegant Professor Qlen, accompanied by his assistant Alan. Qlen approaches Julie, thanking her for accepting the mission, but there was something strange on Julie's face. It wasn't anger or killing intent, but a flushed face, as if she didn't know how to look at Qlen. Remember, the last time they saw each other, Qlen asked Julie for 1 smile a month. She wanted to give Qlen her best smile, but when the moment came, she realized she didn't even know how. This conflicted Julie's feelings, as she hated Qlen with a passion, and yet she was making a great effort for him. The scene was quite awkward, so Varen steps forward and introduces himself to Qlen. Varen was a highly skilled warrior, so as long as Qlen was in his hands, nothing bad could happen to him. Without a doubt, Varen looked strong. But to be sure, Qlen used his insight on Varen. To his surprise, Varen didn't emit any kind of energy, which was quite strange. In any case, Varen would be Qlen's guard for the entire long journey, so Julie leaves them alone. Julie leaves, putting Qlen in Varen's hands. But before she goes, she manages to offer Qlen a creepy smile, one that sent shivers down his spine. But hey, at least she's trying to keep her promise, Qlen thinks. Several hours later, the train begins its journey. All was calm, so Qlen tells Varen to rest for now. Qlen relaxes in his seat, but he knows perfectly well that he must remain alert. Subtitles by the Amara org community. The assembly meeting wasn't called the Tomb of Mages for nothing. Every time one was held, one of the trains heading there was attacked. It was a sort of test for the players, where by following clues, they had to choose the train that would safely get them to the meeting. In the game, the original Qlen was a textbook corrupt noble, so he had many contacts in the underworld and knew exactly which trains to avoid. But for the current Qlen, things were very different. When Mujin took over his body, he lost all his contacts. Of course, Qlen had prepared for whatever might come, which is why he acquired advanced combat techniques before he left. A few days ago, Qlen offered to let Alan come to the mages meeting, and to his surprise, he accepted. Qlen didn't expect that, as it's well known that these meetings are very dangerous. The fact that Alan decided to go to such a dangerous place meant he had far more ambition than Qlen thought. At least, that's what he thinks now. In any case, the train is approaching its destination, and they were almost safe. This makes Qlen think that maybe he chose a safe train after all. It disappoints him a little, since he had actually armed himself to the teeth to fight if necessary. Not only had he acquired highly defensive equipment, but he also had his magic spread throughout the train in case of an attack. He even bought a powerful set of armor for Alan, just in case. And now that he thinks about it, he armed up so much and used so much power to strengthen everything that he was quite low on mana. But one should not skimp on expenses, a wise old man once said. So Qlen takes it in stride. Luckily for Qlen, he's having a very relaxed trip. But then, boom, a bomb goes off on the train. But before that, let's go back 3 days. We joined Sylvia and her Iliad family. It was clear that Sylvia was going to be named the next arch-mage, so she was even skipping many of her university classes. But as she said that, deep down, she felt she'd like to attend more of Professor Qlen's classes. In any case, the Iliad family was heading to the meeting well in advance. Very differently from what the rest of the mages were doing. This was very strange to Sylvia, and she asks why they weren't going with the other mages. Because Tomb of the Mage is an understatement for this meeting, her father says. And her father knew exactly what he was talking about. Apparently in the last meeting, which was 15 years ago, more than 11 mages died. It turns out that only 20 families are summoned to the meeting. And if you were one of those 20 families, your entire name went down in history. But if for some reason a family failed to attend the meeting, the entire family was branded as trash, and their position was quickly given to another family. Sylvia couldn't believe what she was hearing. But it was all true. The mages' meeting was an act of great honor and prestige, and for that reason, the perfect opportunity for the envious to eliminate talented people. With that said, Sylvia's father hopes she understands why they are going so early. They were invited and had to go to the meeting no matter what, something they didn't actually like. Ciao. But if they were caught skipping the meeting, the punishment would be tremendous. Now we return to Professor Deku and Undalen, and a bomb that appeared just for laughs. Deku feels the explosion immediately. And even before the explosion, Deku telekinesis was already making the entire train float. This was no cheap trick to pull off. The train was floating in the air, and on top of it was a group of thugs, stunned by the situation. But that didn't matter. They had a job to do, and if they did it, they'd be paid very well. So they quickly began to enter the train by breaking the windows. Poor idiots, thinks the protagonist, since the savages had just given Deku more weapons to attack with. So, using the very pieces of the blown-up train, he began to massacre the bandits. They were brutally torn to shreds. Meanwhile, Alan doesn't even understand what he's seeing. Look, it's better if I just put you to sleep, Deku thinks, and applies a sleep spell on him. Deku could handle the bandits on his own, so he asks Varen to get Alan and the other passengers to safety. With them off the train, Deku was completely alone. Or let's correct that. It was him, along with a bunch of lab rats. Professor Deku had a crazy theory about natural death by magic and planned to test it on the bandits. While Deku did his thing, Varen watched from a distance. It was a bloodbath. One so intense that it left Deku completely exhausted. He had reduced the power of a bomb and levitated an entire train. On top of that, he fought against several thugs. His mana was at its limit, as were his body and mind. And then Varen arrived, saying that all the passengers were now safe. Deku looked at his face, and it said anything but safe. Though it was normal since they had just been attacked. So Varen must have been quite tense. Poor fool for thinking that, because Varen took a step toward Deku and a death warning began to flash throughout the train. Deku had let his guard down, and because of that, it was very possible he would die right there. Varen raises his sword and thanks the thugs for leaving Deku alive, so that he could eliminate him himself. Deku asks Varen if Julie ordered him to attack, or if he was doing it on his own. But Julie's name was too good for the protagonist's filthy mouth, so Varen tells him to shut up. Julie was one of the most respected knights of the Order, and because of Deku her honor was slowly withering away. For Julie, his great master and his most precious person, Varen would end Deku life. Deku was a 10 mono and could only remember the face of the guard captain who told him Varen was an excellent guard. Varen was considered quite strong and initially, Deku has nothing he can do against him. In fact, Varen's attacks were agile and swift, so fast that Deku could barely block them. With little choice, Deku cancels his telekinesis. So the entire train begins to fall into the void from high up on a bridge. But now we cut to Sylvia. She had been feeling a bit down for a few days, and not even the most exquisite food in the place seemed to cheer her up. Apparently, all the mages for the meeting were already there. All of them, except for Professor Deku. Not that Sylvia really cared, but she asked to be informed immediately when he arrived. It turns out Sylvia saw something she wasn't supposed to see. It all happened a few days ago. Sylvia's mother had left this world a long time ago, and Sylvia often visited her grave. And during one of her visits, she saw something that caught her attention. To her surprise, it was Professor Deku, someone she never expected to see in a place like this. But he wasn't his usual self. He was on his knees on the ground, his shoulders slumped. That was already a lot for Sylvia's mind to process. But it overloaded even more when she saw that Professor Deku was shedding tears. Professor Deku was the most serious and stoic person you could ever meet. But even he was capable of shedding tears for a loved one. To Sylvia, this was fascinating. Deku was a cold and serious person, but he also had painful memories from years past. For some reason, Sylvia couldn't get the image of Deku shedding tears out of her head, and for some reason, it also made her chest feel tight. Besides, her father had told her that the trains were often attacked, very frequently, so that was bothering her quite a bit. Sylvia was tired of waiting for Deku, so she decided to do something herself. Sylvia possessed the power of the 3 primary colors. This was creation magic. But her magic didn't work on its own. With everything in her possession and after much effort, Sylvia performed her first spell of pure creation. A shining, living that Sylvia named Sweet. With her creation ready, Sylvia sends it flying, and from now on, they would share the same vision. Now we return to Professor Duel and Varen. They had avoided falling off the cliff by a sheer miracle, but they were barely hanging from a mountain. Duel was using every skill at his disposal, but he still had several broken ribs and bones. And that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was Varen's brutal attacks. They were precise and fast, and it seemed like Varen hadn't received a single wound. At one point, Duel managed to land a solid hit. But it was all useless, as Varen's armor was much stronger than the protagonist's magic. Varen was losing his patience with Duel, so thrust after thrust, he cornered Duel with swift attacks. Varen was already much stronger than Duel to begin with, and even if Duel were at full mana, he couldn't do anything. And it's at that moment that one of Duel's passive skills activates Resolve. The original Duel was an incredibly arrogant person, so even if he fought someone 1,000 times stronger, he wouldn't feel the slightest bit of fear. But while that might sound good, he was still weaker, so it didn't take long for Varen to break through Duel's defenses. Duel watched as his rival's blade went straight for his face and wondered what would happen next. Would he die? Or would he get an extra life like in all the games? The thing is, blood spurts out like a fountain, and the protagonist prays to wake up in his office. But instead of that, time seemed to stop suddenly. And without understanding how, Varen's hand went flying across the room. Varen screamed in pain and recoiled from Duel. And he for his part had no idea what was happening, but he planned to take advantage of this opportunity. He only had 3 mana left, but it was enough to make a small cut on Varen's legs. That cut made Varen fall to the ground, with the misfortune of having the hole right behind him. Varen fell through the hole, but using his dagger, he managed to cling to the edge of the abyss with his one good hand. Duel gets to his feet, and with his usual demeanor, he looks down at Varen from the top of the world. Duel asks Varen why he is trying to kill him, and Varen replies that he had nothing against Duel personally, but since he ruined Julie's life, he couldn't let him live. Duel stares at Varen and asks what kind of relationship he had with his fiancée. Something that, even if Varen explained, Duel wouldn't be able to understand. It all happened a few years ago. Julie was already the captain of the guard and carried out various commissions for the nobles. On one of those occasions, she had caught a young boy who had struck a wealthy noble. Varen had hit the typical obnoxious nobles who thought they were a big deal just for being nobles. But that didn't matter. The boy had broken into a noble's house, so he was going straight to jail. But then Julie noticed something. The walls of the noble's house were extremely high. Varen was small and scrawny, but he might have some hidden talent. So Julie personally offered to take Varen to his cell, and as she did, the boy repeated over and over that he was only defending himself from the nobles. Nobles had a reputation for being cruel and twisted, so Julie was sure Varen was telling the truth. But even so, he shouldn't hit others, as that just put him on the same level as the nobles. Julie put her hands on Varen's shoulders and promised that if he followed her, she would teach him to be a great person. "So you're going to feed me, right?" Varen asks. In any case, after that, Varen followed Miss Julie wherever she went. Varen became a good man, but since he wasn't of the same class as the others, he was always kept on the sidelines. The only person who stayed by his side after all that time was Julie. She was strong and brave, the one who was always at the forefront on the battlefield. Thanks for watching the video. But she was also sweet and delicate, like a true high-class lady. She was even one of the few warriors who couldn't be bought with money. The respect Varen felt for Julie grew with each passing day. Until, unable to help it, that respect for Julie turned into love. Varen is well aware that his feelings for Julie were wrong, but he still couldn't help them. But without a doubt, Professor Duel was much worse. And for Julie's sake, Duel had to be eliminated. Duel remained silent, and thinking it over, one way or another, Duel had destroyed the lives of most of the characters in that world. But the Duel of now is not the same as he was a few months ago. So Duel promises Varen that he will do everything to change his ways, and to start, he offers his hand to Varen. Duel is firm in what he says and swears that for nothing in the world will he let anything bad happen to Julie. Deku Elian's words were touching and even beautiful. But Varen had no intention of changing his mind and won't stop until Deku Elian is dead. No matter what happens or what he has to do, Varen swears he will take Deku Elian's head. In that case, Deku Elian lifts a sharp piece of iron and calls Varen stupid. Deku Elian makes Varen fall into the void, while Varen still hopes that his Lady Julie will be happy in the end. The entire scene was observed very closely by the Golden Bird Suite, which, in turn, transmitted everything it saw to Sylvia. She saw everything that happened up close and understands that Deku Elian had to eliminate Varen in self-defense. Sylvia was pondering everything she saw when a butler informed her that the assembly of mages was about to begin. Sylvia heads towards it, hoping that Professor Deku Elian arrives at the meeting on time. Returning to the train, we are introduced to Lillian Freeman, second in command of the security office. The security force seemed accustomed to train attacks, so they didn't even pay much attention to the matter. Although there was something worrying to people were nowhere to be found, Professor Deku Elian and his guard Varen. With no other choice, they decide to question the train's passengers. Although Alan was still unconscious, so they couldn't get much out of him. The passengers explained that they were attacked by bandits and Varen got them safely off the train. They were in shock from the situation, but one of the passengers managed to take a photo of Deku Elian's tremendous telekinetic power. The situation seemed somewhat absurd to Lillian, but then some strange thoughts came to her. Varen betrayed Professor Deku Elian and tried to kill him, but Deku Elian was stronger and Varen failed. Those thoughts didn't belong to Lillian. Without much time to think, someone appears through the icy mist. It was a badly bruised Professor Deku Elian. Deku Elian had been extremely lucky to survive. Deku Elian had no idea who attacked Varen and cut off his hand. But if it weren't for them, it would be Deku Elian at the bottom of the ravine right now. Worst of all, Varen wasn't even an important or named character in the story, and yet he almost killed him. In any case, Lillian is glad to see the professor safe and wanted to ask him a few questions. I have about 6 hours to get to the meeting, thinks Deku Elian. But Lillian's questions will be quick and brief, so they won't take long. But no, Deku Elian vanished as quickly as he arrived. This surprised Lillian a bit, as Deku Elian must have had a huge amount of mana to be able to move so fast. And don't be fooled by the officer's sweet face. Through the red ribbon, Lohar. Anyway, now we go to the assembly of mages. It was almost 9:30 at night, and the meeting was about to begin. Unfortunately for them, Deku Elian and Varen were nowhere to be seen. And then from a raised chair, as if it were a throne, an intense magical force began to emanate. That was the power of Destined, Khan, the great elder of Berk T. He should have been the arch-mage of the kingdom, but instead, he left the political world and dedicated himself solely to magic. Sylvia is amazed by his strength and trembles just thinking that she will have to be as strong as him to become the arch-mage of the kingdom. The meeting begins, and Destined calls out the summoned families, as if this were a school class. The first to present themselves were those of the Iliadi family, with Gideon as the family head. Then there was Athenes, of the Brand family, Bertram of the Beorit family, and Helm, whom we already know from the Rewan family. And when it was Deku Elian's turn, there was only silence. Deku Elian Klein was nowhere to be found. But the mages had some patience, so if he appeared within 3 minutes, they would let it slide. The Klein family's absence was very strange to everyone, as they had been in the magic meetings since their founding. But that's how the assembly meetings were. Every now and then, a family head disappears, and their entire family falls from grace. This time, the unfortunate ones were the Klein family, and all the nobles laughed out loud. Something that, for some reason, was really angering Sylvia. In any case, a minute passed, and Deku Elian didn't appear. The second passed, and Deku Elian still hadn't appeared. The third minute was about to arrive, and Sylvia feared the worst for Deku Elian. But then the assembly door opened right behind her, and exuding a bit of aura, not much, just enough, Professor Deku Elian arrives. He brushes the ice off his jacket, tidies up his hair. And now, looking presentable, he introduces himself as the head of the Klein family, Professor Deku Elian. With him present, the meeting began immediately. The first matter was related to the appearance of demons. For this, Athenes proposed that the mages in the church's forces cooperate on patrols and exploration missions, something no one was against, so that part was resolved quickly and easily. Of course, I said quick and easy, but in reality, they spent almost 6 straight hours confirming every last minor detail. It was exhausting, but luckily, they had a break time to grab a snack. And Destined really needed a break. He had run for miles in a snowstorm, and his mana and physical stamina were at their limit. Destined felt like he was going to break into 1,000 pieces at any moment. But on the outside, he looked as fresh as a daisy. As the break began, Alan appeared from around a corner, crying like crazy. He apologizes to Destined for not helping during the journey, but given the situation, Destined understands. Still, Destined doesn't trust Alan one bit anymore. He definitely knows things, or at the very least, he's not the innocent kid he appears to be. But then Destined remembered another famous movie quote. Keep your allies close, but your enemies closer. So Destined tells Alan not to leave his side for a single second. Alan was not the innocent boy he claimed to be, and Destined planned to get to the very bottom of his soul. In any case, after a short break, the meeting continued. And this time, they would talk about the Red Ribbon member that Destined fought, a rather delicate matter for all the mages. Bertram, head of the B'Orit family, was furious about the situation, as the Blood Ribbons were cockroaches to society and had to be exterminated down to the last one as soon as possible. And that was fine for almost everyone, but the thing is, you could only confirm someone was a Blood Ribbon at birth. Aside from being born covered in reed, they were identical to humans. But that didn't matter to Bertram, who even wanted to invent some racial difference to be able to hunt down as many people as possible and hopefully exterminate the Blood Ribbons along the way. Of course, that would be a massacre, and most nobles did not share his opinion. But Bertram continues with his argument and even says that the Blood Ribbons have found a way to identify each other and are now gathering under a leader. Of course, this was all pure speculation, with no proof whatsoever, and they accused Bertram of trying to cause chaos in the kingdom. But there was one very clear question for everyone. Weren't all those present disgusted by the Blood Ribbons? Apparently they were in a similar situation 60 years ago. Subtitles by the Amara org community. And due to the indecisiveness of the leadership, tons of mages ended up dying. Gideon then raises his voice and says he would like to hear Professor Destined's direct opinion. After all, he was the one who found one. The Ukline family has always been the Empire's spear against the demons. So Professor Destined must have something to say. But Destined didn't know what to say. After all, the mistreatment of inferior races was deeply rooted in this world. And whatever he said wouldn't change a thing. But still, Destined had to delay the massacre of the Red Ribbons. At least as much as possible, or the main quest would become much more complicated in the future. After all, the Red Ribbons had absolutely nothing to do with the true villain of this game. In any case, Destined begins his speech. He had been researching the records against the Red Ribbons from their beginnings and concluded that it was all a misunderstanding between races. 237 years ago, an innocent witch named the Witch of Rodin was burned by mistake. That was only the beginning, and after that, the burning of innocents became a daily occurrence for the common people. Coincidentally, those who suffered the most losses were the Red Ribbons, and that's why they began to seek revenge. After that was the incident from 60 years ago, which was actually a poorly handled political matter. The Empire wanted a mine, but it was in Red Ribbon territory, and for that reason, they fought again. All these words were annoying Bertram a bit, as it was precisely an ancestor of Destined who killed all the Red Ribbons at that mine. But Destined makes it clear, his family's tradition was to kill demons, not Red Ribbons. To which Bertram replies that Red Ribbons were also demons. Bertram erupts in anger and just spouts shouts and insults in the hall. But Destined expects Bertram to take responsibility for what he says, as branding humans as demons was a very serious matter for his family. Because to start with, who's to say Bertram isn't a demon right now, trying to cause chaos for the mages? That was too much for Bertram, who just got up from the table and left the meeting. With this meeting concluded, Sylvia's father bids her farewell, as the rules in the place were very strict, and only the heads of families could wander around freely. This annoyed Sylvia a little, as they still treated her like a little girl. Although upon reaching her room, she did indeed feel like a little girl. The rules of the place were very extensive, and just one mistake could cause her entire family to go down the drain. This was too much pressure for Sylvia, so she decided to sleep and stay in her room until the next meeting. But, in the middle of the night, she woke up with a tremendous thirst. And as she got out of bed, she felt something very strange. The walls around her seemed to split in two, and flashes of magic flooded the room. This terrified Sylvia, and she thought she had accidentally broken one of the rules of the place. She grabs the list of rules and reviews them one by one, but her mind wasn't in a state to read notes as everything around her slowly transformed. One of the rules of the place was that once you were asleep in your bed, you should not get up until the next morning. Her father had already warned her that this place was no joke, and now Sylvia found herself in a kind of alternate world. Sylvia thought that by not leaving her room, she would be safe, but one foolish mistake and she was already in deep trouble. Sylvia walked through the mysterious and dark corridors of the place, until a chill behind her froze her in place. But she had already learned not to stand still in fear, so she ran in the opposite direction. This place was quite strange and complicated, but Sylvia just had to follow certain instructions. To begin with, the place had only one floor, so if she saw any stairs going up or down, she had to avoid them at all costs. In addition to that, even if she saw an open door and curiosity called to her, she was not to look inside the rooms for any reason. Sylvia had to remain calm and, above all, not panic, as there was a special door in that place that would get her out of trouble. Although another rule said that if a door was knocked on, you should not open it for any reason. But still, finding herself cornered, Sylvia went straight to a door and began to pound on it as if her life depended on it. Sylvia didn't even know what she was doing and just kept pounding on that door, knowing that no one would open it, as the rules forbade it. Sylvia was about to give up, her face covered in sorrow and tears. But then the door she was hitting suddenly opened, and from inside the room appeared Professor Destined, very worried about her. Sylvia could barely speak, and her blushing face told Destined that she was having a very hard time. So with no other choice, Destined invited Sylvia into his room. Sylvia apologizes for the scene she made, but Destined isn't surprised. After all, this place was full of spirits and powerful magic, so practically anything could happen at any moment. Destined remained impassive and elegant, while telling Sylvia that she must follow all the rules of the house at any cost. And suddenly, a strange creature in the shape of a skull fell on Sylvia. She was terrified, but Destined told her not to do anything, since with him present, no creature could harm her. Destined's telekinesis had improved immensely, and now he was even capable of destroying monsters with simple pieces of stone. Sylvia is amazed and asks Destined if he really eliminated a ghost with just stones. That might sound fabulous, but Destined didn't see it that way. After all, magic was never created to kill. Those words moved Sylvia's heart. So she tried to get his attention with all the magic she had learned in his classes. Lightning, flowers, even fire created with goblin blood. Sylvia displayed all her fabulous techniques before Destined. They were all powerful and very well executed, but Destined just told Sylvia that she was doing very well, barely paying attention. Sylvia was getting quite annoyed, to the point where she even tried a new spell. And for the first time, Destined said something to Sylvia, telling her that the spell wasn't quite right. This motivated Sylvia, and she quickly asked what its weak point was. But that was something Sylvia had to figure out for herself, which annoyed her quite a bit, since Professor Destined did help Luna understand her exercises. But, on that occasion, Destined simply told Luna she was useless, and everything Luna did was through her own effort. And now Destined expected Sylvia to do the same and learn on her own. Destined asked Sylvia not to be so impatient. She was already above all her classmates, and it would be difficult for anyone to catch up to her. So she should take things slowly and study calmly. Sylvia will be one of the 3 great arch-mages sooner or later, so Destined asks her not to be in such a hurry and to take it easy. Of course, it wasn't the first time someone had told her that. Since she was a child, everyone around her had said the same thing. For Sylvia, it was always just flattery, but hearing it from Professor Destined touched her a little deep inside. As the hours passed, Sylvia fell asleep on Destined's bed, while he continued with his papers. At one point, he seems to see magical energy entering through the window. So, forgetting the school rules, he decides to go out for a bit to see what's happening. This magic had golden races, which meant Destined could find a great fortune nearby. But then, surprisingly, A hideous spirit appeared, screaming next to the protagonist. "Boo," says the ghost. "Beep, beep, I said boo," says the ghost. And it said it several times while trying to scare the protagonist in 1,000 different ways. But Dek-yu-Eli simply ignored the spirit. The ghost kept trying to scare Dek-yu-Eli, and until Dek-yu-Eli kindly asks if he had seen any magical objects around. This was too much for the fearsome ghost's pride, so it just covered its face with its hands and ran away crying. There are no serious ghosts these days, the protagonist remarks. But shortly after searching, Dek-yu-Eli found what he was looking for on his own. If you've read the Manga Villain's Survival Guide at the Academy, this subject will look familiar. It's a fragment of a tree struck by lightning, one of the most common creation items in these types of stories. Dek-yu-Eli had hit the jackpot. With this item, he could create the best wand in the world, a perfect weapon for his class. But returning to the meeting, it continued as it was. Bertram argued that the red ribbons are demons because they have demon blood. That logic didn't work for Professor Dek-yu-Eli. The discussion was heated, and the nobles began to think that Dek-yu-Eli was defending the enemy. This greatly surprised Gideon Iliadi, as Dek-yu-Eli was destroying his family's reputation with a single stroke. But Dek-yu-Eli was a cold and calculating mind, and everyone present assumed that Dek-yu-Eli was up to something. However, they were all mistaken, and only Sylvia realized that Professor Dek-yu-Eli was just speaking pure truths. In the end, the great sage Dezek-Kun stops the dispute, as if they dragged it out much longer, they would get nowhere. For now, they could take a long and well-deserved break, and then, if necessary, another meeting would be held to continue the dispute. Of course, Bertram couldn't hide his anger and stormed out of the room in a fury, pushing past people. Dek-yu-Eli had suddenly made many enemies among the nobility, but in exchange, he had delayed the massacre of the red ribbons. The next day, in the shops of Berkti, Dek-yu-Eli, along with Alan, was browsing a store. Dek-yu-Eli needed materials to create his magic wand, and there was no better place than Berkti itself, the city of mages. At one point, Alan points to a person. It was the second in command of the security office, Lillian, the one who brought Alan safely to the city. To thank Lillian for her help, Dek-yu-Eli invited her to eat, an offer she wouldn't dream of refusing. Lillian was happy to be invited by the great Professor Dek-yu-Eli. But without wasting a second, she asks him what happened to his guard, Varen. Well, he died on the train, obviously. Dek-yu-Eli replies. Oh, okay then, Lillian says, not knowing what else to ask. At that moment she remembered Lohar, since it was his fault she was in this situation. Flashing back a bit, we see Lohar being sentenced to life in prison, destined to spend the rest of his days in a very dark cell. His judge was Lillian, and Lohar accepted all the charges. Until Lillian asked Lohar to do his thing. And his thing was to create an energy wave that completely turned off all the cameras in the room. With them off, Lillian's personality changed abruptly. She was very angry with Lohar, as because of him, all her hard work was going down the drain. Lillian even considers eliminating Lohar, since the more red ribbons are out there, the more danger the rest will be in. Luckily for them, the only way to prove someone was a red ribbon was to see them at birth. And it's true that red ribbons were indistinguishable from humans. They possessed no special abilities, no demonic powers, not even a higher capacity for mana. There was no way to detect them after birth. But with the Yu Klein family, everyone had to be very careful. Dek-yu-Eli's family was very dangerous to them, so if they saw anything suspicious, they had to eliminate the entire family. However, Lohar stands firm and says that the Yu Klein family had changed a lot, and especially that the family head, Dek-yu-Eli, was now a true noble. A true noble? Are you an idiot or what? Asks Lillian. But Lohar reaffirms what he said and tells her how Professor Dek-yu-Eli saw them as normal humans. Dek-yu-Eli knew that Lohar was a blood ribbon, but he still said nothing. Otherwise, he'd be in a body bag by now, not sitting in an office. Lillian asks Lohar if he wasn't aware of who the Yuklines were. They were the spear against the demons, the ones who had massacred them the most in the past. And yet, Lohar says that Dek-yu-Eli was different. Something that was driving Lillian crazy. In any case, for now, they were safe, as there was no way to prove someone was a red ribbon. There was only one way. Apparently there was a certain element they had a very hard time eating, But as long as they stayed away from it, everything was fine. In any case, the current emperor is about to kick the bucket, and when the new one arrives, they will declare new laws for the red ribbons, so they will wait until then to see what happens. For now, Lillian releases Lohar and very seriously tells him to stay hidden. Now we return to the dinner with Dec-Uelien on Lillian, and she still didn't know what to think of Dec-Uelien. And without letting her think much, someone who reeked of alcohol arrived. It was Dec-Uelien's old friend, Helm, and he seemed pretty drunk. Helm was standing there half-minus drunk to say something very serious to Dec-Uelien. But before we find out what, we go to Julie's nightly office, where, sadly, Julie was being informed that Varen had fallen in the line of duty. Julie stands up from her seat, furious, and she expects Dec-Uelien to have a good explanation for everything that happened. Returning to the awkward dinner, Lillian was quite tense, as although he didn't look it, Helm was a rather important person. The thing is, Helm was upset with Dec-Uelien because he spent the mages' assembly defending the red ribbons. Information that greatly surprised Lillian. The thing is, Helm knew the original Dec-Uelien very well and knew he was a supremacist who wanted to see all other races burn. And he knows this because Dec-Uelien himself had told him so aloud several times. Even now, if you went to the university, you could find articles written in Dec-Uelien's own handwriting, saying that only the human race should endure above all others. Helm says all sorts of things to Dec-Uelien, all painful and true, so Dec-Uelien couldn't even defend himself. But you know how Dec-Uelien is. But in any case, Dec-Uelien's magic evaluation will be in just 3 months, and then his true power will be revealed. As for Lillian, she was still freaking out that the one and only Dec-Uelien was defending them. I mean, he's a Klein. But, in the end, luckily for her, it seems that everything Lohar told her was true. In any case, we move on to the next day. Dec-Uelien had gathered all the materials for his wand, so he gave them to a famous craftsman to create one for him. As fate would have it, this activated a sub-minus quest in the system, which he completed instantly, earning him a coin. But as he was leaving the city of Berkti, Dec-Uelien had the bad luck of being on the same train as Bertram, so the exchange of glares was immediate. Bertram didn't hide his hostility for even a second of the journey, but luckily, he didn't do anything strange. Fortunately for Dec-Uelien, after many incidents, it seems that this journey will finally come to an end. And after a long train ride, they arrived at the Empire, where the entire knightly guard was waiting for them. Julie appears before Dec-Uelien with a clearly downcast face. Still, the first thing she does is ask about Dec-Uelien's health, although it was clear she already knew about Varen's fate. All the knights were hurt by the death of their comrade Varen, and at the same time, they looked with hatred at the miserable Dec-Uelien who had survived. Julie had heard that he and Varen helped the passengers, and she wanted to know if that was all true. Julie's sad face was one Dec-Uelien had never seen before. When he arrived, he fully intended to tell her what happened, that Varen betrayed him and tried to kill him from behind. And although the battle was already over, Varen left Dec-Uelien no choice but to finish him off. But now that Dec-Uelien was in front of Julie, he froze and wasn't sure what he was going to tell her. Julie's heart and soul were as delicate as stones balanced on top of each other, and the truth might be too much for her. Without a doubt, Julie would blame herself for everything that happened and would gradually question every action she took. As painful as it was, the right thing to do at that moment was not to tell Julie the truth, even if it meant enduring the hateful stares of the entire Night Corps. So Dec-Uelien said what was expected. Varen fought until the end to protect the train's victims, but in the end he fell off a cliff. This didn't gladden Julie's heart, but at least it didn't make it worse, and Julie thanks Dec-Uelien for telling her everything. After that, the Night Corps leaves Dec-Uelien alone. This annoyed Alan quite a bit. After all, they were also victims and survived by a sheer miracle. But still, they were looked at as if they were rash. And then out of nowhere, Sylvia appears, who asks Dec-Uelien why he didn't tell the truth. Dec-Uelien doesn't understand the question, but he was even more confused when he received a gift from Sylvia. She handed a book to Dec-Uelien and, without saying a word, ran away. Well, okay then, say Alan and Dec-Uelien. Without a doubt, this journey had been very eventful, and Dek-Yu-Elian just hopes to get home in one piece and collapse on his bed. Luckily for them, home was just a few steps away. Back with the knights, they were being informed about the whole incident on the train. And word for word, it seems everything happened just as Dek-Yu-Elian had explained. Julie wanted to investigate the train incident, but there was an unwritten rule in the Empire that forbade investigating train cases. In any case, Julie had lost her right-hand man, and at the same time, the person she trusted the most, something she will never forgive her foolish friend for. Now we go to Dek-Yu-Elian's mansion, where his sister Uriel was giving him the scolding of his life, since once again, the crazy Dek-Yu-Elian went on a wild spending spree. Uriel thought she had made it quite clear. Their family was almost in ruins, and if Dek-Yu-Elian continued with his nonsense, they wouldn't last another 2 months. And Dek-Yu-Elian really didn't want to spend money. It's just that the person creating his wand turned out to be a very famous craftsman. So the bill skyrocketed. In any case, Dek-Yu-Elian asks his sister to calm down and takes her to the room with the treasures he had already bought. Yes, they're very beautiful, says his sister. But Dek-Yu-Elian only bought these things to show off to the nobles. Child, be quiet for a moment and respect your brother, says Dek-Yu-Elian. You're telling me to shut up, you piece of trash. You know what? I think if the butler hadn't stopped her, Dek-Yu-Elian would be 6 feet under right now. The thing is, Dek-Yu-Elian had been thinking about it for a long time and didn't know exactly how to make money from the auction items, until the obvious hit him touched them with his Midas touch ability. Well, with that done, now all the items should be worth much more. So Dek-Yu-Elian summons the treasure appraisers. This angered his sister a bit, since these items had just been bought, so no one would pay more than the price Dek-Yu-Elian paid. Still, Dek-Yu-Elian summons the appraisers. Dek-Yu-Elian was very sure he had discovered a gold mine. You remember the ancient vase Dek-Yu-Elian bought at the beginning, right? Well, it turns out it went from being a clay vase to a vase by the master Oriental craftsman, a legendary artifact that turned flowers inside it into miraculous healing potions. Dek-Yu-Elian was quite satisfied. Before he had an expensive vase, and now he had an artifact that even he wanted for himself. In any case, his sister remained skeptical since when a noble sells their newly bought treasures, it gives a very bad impression. Something that obviously Dek-Yu-Elian cared very little about, as his only goal right now was to make money. So chill out, sis. Now we go to the newly formed club of Luna and her friends. They're all gathered. They were having their first tough dispute. 3 of a kind, exclaims Luna, leaving the entire room shivering, as Luna was wiping the floor with all her companions. Luna laughed and played with all her friends, something that felt like a dream to her. She came from a small commoner family and didn't go to school or the academy. So since Luna entered the magic tower, she had felt very lonely. It wasn't just the high-class students who had her in their sights. There were many incidents and misfortunes around her. But now she was happy with her companions, whom she could call friends. But then one of the professors had to arrive, very angry. He had received a tip that the university's commoners were making illegitimate use of the facilities, and the professor was about to explode. It was Professors R.E. Ellen and Beck, the professors who gave the lower-class students the most trouble. The professor asks rudely what they were doing there, as no professor would give them permission to create a group. Luna maintained her composure and calmly and politely explained to the professor that they had permission to create the club. But that couldn't be, and the professor called Luna everything but a pretty name. And not just bad words, but the kind that get channels demonetized. And also the kind that make a cute girl put you on her blacklist. The professor didn't like Luna's sharp gaze one bit, so he continued calling her names for a while. She, of course, wasn't going to stand still while being insulted. Her friend Julia had to stop her from smashing the professor's face in. As for the other professors, he was just laughing like a weasel behind the door. It was all shouts and insults from the professors, without realizing that someone was approaching them. The professor continued spitting insults and says there was no professor foolish enough to give permission to the poor. "Were you calling for me?" asks Dek-Yu-Elian from behind. Dek-Yu-Elian looms over the professor and hopes he has no complaints about how he manages his students. Dek-Yu-Elian's presence at that moment was imposing, so much so that even Luna had to lower her gaze. Professor Dek-Yu-Elian enters his classroom and hopes that some grown-sub teachers aren't bothering his students. Deku had just been scolded by his sister for several hours straight. So he was in a foul mood and seemed to be looking for an excuse to get into a fight with someone. Luckily, there was no problem, just that the professor saw that the room was very empty. This place was not worthy of Professor Deku's great students, so he was thinking of finding them a better place. Professor Arch-mage was truly a generous character, so Deku will leave the move in his hands. With him gone, he took another look at the other student. He looks him up and down and, with a face of total contempt, calls him a cockroach. Immediately after, Deku left, but Cockroach was left with rage boiling inside him. Later, in the university classes, all the students had heard about the train accident, so they all asked Professor Deku what had happened. But Deku wasn't there for gossip, so he began his class. This time, they would study pure elements and spell interference. Magic interference is exactly what it sounds like, stopping another mage's spell using your own. Deku liked to teach through practice, so he distributes a bunch of magic crystals among his students. These magic stones were worth more than 3,000 coins each, which was a fortune. Deku was controlling them with his telekinetic power, and if anyone managed to catch a stone and keep it, it would be all theirs. This greatly motivated Luna, so much so that she interrupted the class with her desperate screams. In any case, the test began, and each of the students tried to snatch one of the stones from Deku. The protagonist knew how to take advantage of his classes, as his telekinesis was quite strong. But he couldn't get complacent. In these classes, he could develop his skills without raising suspicion and also teach his students something useful. Especially Sylvia and Luna, who would have to lead the humans in the battles to come. This time, Luna was very motivated. Money was raining down on her out of nowhere, so she applied herself to the fullest. On the other hand, Sylvia looked at her with envious eyes. Professor Deku had already told her that Luna was about to catch up, and if she didn't get serious, all her effort would have been in vain. The test continued, and all the students radiated great magical power. There were more than 150 students, and Professor Deku was fighting against each of them, which demonstrated an absurdly high level of control over his power. And in truth, the one who was most surprised was the protagonist himself. Not by his power, but because his students were extremely weak. He was fighting against 150 of them, and he could still handle them. Let's remember that Professor Deku is still a beginner-level mage. And then the first stone was freed. It was the result of Sylvia's hard work. The first thing she did was look at Luna with a clear expression of superiority. But Luna wasn't even looking at her. In any case, the protagonist already expected Sylvia to free the stone. After all, she far surpassed the rest of the students. The test continued for several more minutes, but no one else seemed able to pass it, so they were about to end. But from a corner, bleeding from the eyes, Luna emerged victorious, taking the valuable stone as well. This didn't please Sylvia at all, who could only look at Luna with hatred. As for the rest of the class, they tried to snatch the stones with all their might. But the only thing they gained was a major headache and expelling everything they had inside their bodies. The spectacle was so great that the protagonist had to call for a break to rest and clean the room. Luna and her friend couldn't move, but at least Luna managed to pass the test. Although even Luna admits it was so hard she was on the verge of death, as there was a moment when her head was about to explode. Anyway, she had passed the test, something only two in the class had achieved: Luna and Sylvia. Sylvia can't believe that the last place, most useless student in the class, is now just one step below her. Rumor had it that Luna was being secretly trained by Deku, which is a lie. But given Luna's growth, it seemed like Professor Deku was actually doing it. Therefore, he had his favorite students. And it had to be the dumb, poor Luna, which made Sylvia boil with rage. Sylvia had only nice things to say about Luna, to the point of thinking Luna was an arrogant brat, and we all know how characters who say such things about others end up. But hey, you do you, Sylvia. In any case, the test is over, and although everyone did very well, the truth is there was a much easier way to break the professor's telekinesis. True magic interference. In other words, you yourself know the enemy's spell, and by knowing it, you nullify it by overriding it. Put like that, it sounded like a very powerful and easy -to-use spell. The bad thing is that it wasn't practical at all, as you literally had to know every existing spell. In the end, the true magic interference spell was only useful against spells that the mage themselves already used. So in a fight, unless you're fighting yourself or someone very similar to you, it wasn't very useful. But nothing ventured, nothing gained. So Professor Dekuelian explains that what you really had to look for is the core of the spells, and if you deciphered them, the interference became very powerful and much easier to achieve. There were different types of cores in magic, but if you learned them all and learned to differentiate them, you would gain a lot of mental agility and could use magic interference at your complete pleasure. To demonstrate, Professor Dekuelian casts the spell Destruction Disc. This was destruction minus type magic, and its core expanded from the outside in and vice versa. And so it continued for several hours, Dekuelian explaining very complicated things and the students taking notes on everything he said. Hours and hours passed, and the protagonist was well and truly tired. So he yelled at all his useless students for wasting his time and told them they'd better all get a 10 on the upcoming exams. And with a goodbye and a slam of the door, the professor left the room. The worst part is that Professor Dekuelian left the last part unexplained, and now the students didn't know what to do. But Luna didn't care about that, as she had made great progress with her magic in that class. Subtitles by the Amara or community. And then Cockroach appeared belittling the commoners. This triggered the fury of Luna's friend, as that jerk was begging for a beating. The thing is, Cockroach's name is Beck, but I'm going to keep calling him Cockroach. And he was very curious to know how the last in class is now practically the second. Cockroach had no doubts. The miserable Luna, with no home or money, had managed to bribe Professor Dekuelian. An accusation that Luna didn't find funny at all. Remember, she wants to kill Dekuelian, not get on his good side. But Luna couldn't hide it, as everyone in her class knew that Professor Dekuelian gave her lessons at night, which was a lie. Of course, this made Luna very hysterical, and she screamed to the heavens that it was a blatant lie. But it had to be true. After all, Luna was useless until recently, and even the stone she had just gotten was surely left by Dekuelian on purpose, so she could win something and not feel so bad. Cockroach didn't stop attacking Luna. After all, she had no parents or anyone who loved her, so she was surely doing things with Professor Dekuelian at night. Cockroach didn't realize it, but with every word that came out of his mouth, Luna's magical power expanded throughout the room. As for Sylvia, she just observed the situation in silence. And luckily for Luna, Julia was by her side to stop her. After all, if she were accused of attacking a noble again, she would surely be expelled. It was then that Luna remembered when Professor Dekuelian told her that powerful mages must be cold and calculating. So Luna calmed down suddenly, thanks to her friend. And with a smile, she thanked Julia for stopping her, as she really does lose her head sometimes. In the end, Luna and Julia completely ignored Cockroach, who was left shouting at a wall. The words of a snob couldn't matter less to Luna and Julia, so they just go to eat something tasty at the cafeteria. And after a few hours we go to the campus gardens, where Luna was still frustrated. She didn't smash Cockroach's face in because of her friend, but she would definitely have to do it sooner or later. Luna was walking calmly, thinking about her own things, when suddenly Sylvia stops her asking if they could talk for a moment. Sylvia would be very brief, so she asks for some of Luna's time. Although Luna didn't feel much like talking to anyone, as she was fuming and hoped Sylvia wasn't there to pick a fight. And immediately after, Sylvia asks Luna if she and Professor Dekuelian were doing things at night. So, she was looking for a fight. And Luna tells Sylvia to be careful with her, as she won't hesitate for a second to bite her neck and tear it off. I love Luna. The thing is, Luna makes it very clear that she hates Dekuelian and of course wasn't receiving lessons from him. If that was the case, Sylvia was very confused, as Professor Dekuelian hadn't set foot in his lab for over 3 years. Something Luna knew very well. After all, the one who worked in that lab was her father. And Dekuelian was nothing more than a useless person who didn't know how to do anything. Well, that had changed. For a few months now, Professor Dekuelian had cleaned his lab and put it to use, which surprised Luna. Although more than surprising, it left her shivering, as the only thing in that lab was her father's research. Meaning, Dekuelian had found her father's research and was now planning to profit from it. This completely infuriates Luna. But she acts stuff and says she didn't care about anything related to Dekuelian and just wanted to do her own thing. And that's exactly the answer Sylvia wants. Okay? It made it clear to her that Luna was still a failure without ambition. So Luna was doing fine. All she had to do was sit in a corner and watch the true geniuses create magic. A few days later, another of Professor Decuelian's classes was held. And this time it would be something different, so much so that neither Julian or Luna had any idea what it was about. Of course, Cockroach didn't miss the opportunity to bother the commoners. Something they had to take calmly, otherwise, a lot of blood would be shed. In any case, this was going to be Professor Decuelian's last class before the exams, so the professor requested the utmost attention. And the same went for the stands, as behind some curtains, there were hundreds of hidden spectators. That day's class was something special. It would be public practice. People from all over the city were gathered there to see the students, and they had to demonstrate all their power in front of them. The practice would be simple 1-on-1 battles, and they had to make their magic clash. It didn't matter who won or lost the fight. With the rules explained, the battles began. The students were a bit uncomfortable with the situation. But little by little, they adapted to the battles and to the prying eyes. Until finally, they could give their all in each of their spells. Although it didn't matter how motivated some were. This made Cockroach very happy, as Sylvia single-handedly took care of sweeping away all the school's filth. Words that Sylvia herself found partly amusing, as Cockroach was just as useless as the rest. In any case, it was Cockroach's turn to fight. And like the good cockroach he is, he challenged Luna to a duel to humiliate her in front of everyone. Luna didn't say a word, just accepted the duel and stepped into the ring. But before starting, Cockroach didn't miss the chance to call Luna a sellout and accuse her of doing certain favors for Decuelian at night. Words so empty and dirty that they didn't even bother Luna anymore. It was the same old crap. Although Luna did find Cockroach a bit amusing. After all, he and Decuelian are practically clones. Having a bastard clone of Professor Decuelian in front of her was putting her in a very bad mood. And she would prove with her fists that commoners could also be strong. But Cockroach didn't play fair and prepared to send Luna to join her parents with a powerful spell. And in fact, he almost succeeded with a great earth spell. Everything was going great, and Luna was about to bite the dust, when suddenly something strange began to happen to Cockroach's magic. He saw it but didn't believe it. Luna was taking control of all his magic. In the blink of an eye, Cockroach's magic turned against him, and a great fist of earth emerged from the ground and sent the cockroach flying far away. Cockroach had been completely destroyed, and Luna, of course, gloated over him. Although Professor Decuelian was not very happy with the result. The point of this test was to clash pure magic against each other to see which was stronger. But Luna and Cockroach simply had a duel. Luna excuses herself, saying she did it by accident because Cockroach was too weak, but if he gave her another chance, she would do it right. And Decuelian agreed with that. Cockroach was too weak for her, so he himself would find her a worthy opponent. But that wasn't good enough for Luna, and with a firm gaze, she points to her rival. Of course, it's none other than Professor Decuelian himself, the one Luna most longed to fight. This declaration drove Professor Ariellen a little crazy, who called Luna everything but a pretty name. A reaction Luna expected, but she was used to it anyway, so the insults didn't bother her. Besides, a chance to fight Decuelian didn't come every day, and Luna planned to take it. As long as Luna could achieve her goal, she didn't care if the rest of the world called her a lunatic. I won't say all the things Professor Ariellen calls her because YouTube would ban me, but they were so harsh that even Decuelian tells him to shut his trap. The thing is, Decuelian accepted the duel. Whoever fought in the arena could choose their opponent, so Luna could perfectly well challenge him if she wanted. Of course, the two of them were on completely different levels, so Decuelian will concede the first attack. Furthermore, Luna would win if she just managed to move him from his spot. Luna didn't argue and just accepted the conditions. At that moment, both Luna's magic and her heart were racing at 1,000 miles per hour. For years she had dreamed of fighting Decuelian, and now she finally had him in front of her, and he seemed willing to indulge her. Then Luna's magic exploded throughout the area. But as she expected, her rival was too powerful, and Decuelian wasn't even paying attention to her. This duel wasn't for Luna to defeat Decuelian, but to study the difference in power between them and then develop a plan accordingly. At one point, Luna's magic even covered the skies with flames, a scene that did catch Professor Decuelian's attention. In the end, Decuelian was covered in flames. And then Luna covered him with earth magic, trapping him inside and leaving Destined in a sort of protective cocoon. This surprised all the spectators, and even Luna thought she had gone too far with her spell. But not at all. Destined broke her spell as if it were nothing. And in fact, he looked at Luna with a certain look of disappointment. This really hurt Luna's pride. And she once again unleashed a blast of powerful wind on Destined. Apparently Luna had a certain negative habit when it came to fighting. The more she fought, the bigger that flaw became. And at a certain point, Luna's magic wouldn't even activate. Not even she understood what was happening and wondered if Destined had somehow trapped her. Luna could no longer use magic, and Destined was taunting her to her face. But the fight wasn't over yet, so Luna charges at Destined. Her magic wasn't working, but her body was still in perfect condition. But alas, tough luck for Luna. Because with a single tap on the forehead, Destined sent Luna flying to the next neighborhood. Luna's spells weren't bad at all. In fact, Luna had quite a talent for handling the elements in their pure state. However, her lack of basic knowledge played against her, and it seems she used magic more by instinct than by knowledge, which was a total mistake. And all of this, Luna's great talent, is due to the bracelet she wears. It turns out Luna possessed the talent vessel, which basically meant that as long as she wore that bracelet, she could control all the elements of magic. If it were the original Destined, he wouldn't hesitate for a second to take that bracelet from Luna. But anyway, it's not like it's easy for her to get stronger. In any case, Professor Destined had won the duel, but he congratulates Luna on her hard work. And with Luna lying on the ground, that class comes to an end. The next time they see each other will be during the exams. As for the students, they were amazed by Luna, as Destined never congratulated anyone. And she was the first. On the other hand, Cockroach continued to be called Cockroach. At that moment, Luna didn't know exactly what she felt. But for some reason, she felt very happy when Professor Destined acknowledged her power. Leaving the university aside, we go for a moment to the city's port, where Ganesha was waiting for a great friend to return, one she hadn't seen in several years. It was this girl here named Uriel, and remember her well because she's important. I don't know if you remember the protagonist's ex-girlfriend. The one who left him and also left a rather creepy message on a tomb in the cemetery, where the protagonist had already mourned her loss. Well, now it's Uriel, who had reincarnated without knowing how. By the way, remember that Ganesha was supposed to deliver a girl to Destined? Well, it turns out that girl was Uriel. Only Ganesha fell in love with her and couldn't deliver her. The thing is, newly reincarnated, she didn't know what was happening and only understood that she was going to be sold to Destined. She was quite smart and quickly understood that she was in the body of Uriel, one of the characters from her game. The thing is, Ganesha took pity on her, and in the end, she wasn't sold to Destined. Of course, Uriel was smart, and the first thing she had to do was survive in this world. And to do that, she stayed very close to Ganesha, as she was one of the most powerful characters. Her objective was obvious: survive in this world and find a way to return to her home. And now we return to Destined, who had just received his magic wand, Luck. This wand was used to store mana inside it and use it as one's own. Besides, at first glance, it was beautiful because with the aesthetics and straight, it made his weapons adapt to his clothing and way of acting, so it was as if his wand were a part of him. In addition, the protagonist granted it the power of the Eucline lineage, so now that wand could defeat demons very easily. Lost in his thoughts, the servants called him for dinner. And upon arriving at the dining table, he found a great banquet prepared for him. He asked what was going on, but his sister just told him that for once, he could eat something decent. It turns out the family finally had money. The protagonist's antiques had sold like hotcakes. The sales went so well that they couldn't believe it themselves. So now they had plenty of money and wouldn't have to worry about losing the house or other problems. And as a thank you, his sister had prepared a great feast so that Destined could recover his energy. I see little reward there, but well, if it's enough for the protagonist, then fine. Although his sister was a bit rough with her manners, so her brother urges her to improve them, at least if she didn't want to go around acting like an animal. Hours later, we go to the protagonist's office at the university, where he was cursing out the original Destined while reviewing some papers. The protagonist wanted to create good exams for his students, But since he had no idea how to make them, he started reviewing the ones the original duel made. But all his questions were ridiculously difficult, and most weren't even studied at the academy. In other words, the original duel loved to torture his students with impossible exams, also he could look better than them. Duel was truly despicable, so much so that with every new thing the protagonist learns, he feels more disgusted to be in his body. The thing is, the original duel made impossible exams for his students to make himself look like the smartest one. The protagonist was different and really wanted to make good exams for his students. Those exams weren't rash, but he reviewed them to the very last one anyway. But the last exams had nothing to do with duels and must have been the ones made by Luna's father. Those questions were also difficult, but everything on them was taught at the school, and they were also easy to understand. The information in those exams was very valuable, so the protagonist didn't hesitate for a second to use understanding on them. Magic coursed through Professor duel's office with all its might and with great, vivid colors. Until, upon understanding the entire content of the exam, an illusion formed in front of the protagonist. This was a true magic exam. You not only had to answer the questions but also imbue your thoughts with magic until the exam came to life and showed you illusions. That magic was impressive, so much so that it awakened the inner duel in the protagonist, and he was consumed by jealousy. It was the jealousy of a guy who couldn't surpass his own students. But leaving that aside, the protagonist wonders who that girl appearing in the exam's illusions could be. If it's not Luna, it's her mother. There weren't many options. Now, going to the headmaster's office, she was looking at the results of the mages meeting and is surprised to see that for now, they won't be hunting the red ribbon race. Very unexpected, as very few mages sympathize with them. At least among the university professors, they were hated to death. And that included Professor duel who hated them more than anyone. Headmaster Adelaide was a famous mage for her great magical power and was considered the closest to becoming an arch-mage. However, despite her power and fame, her personality was somewhat hilarious. Most mages locked themselves away with their books or trained non-stop. However, Adelaide was a textbook gossip, and wherever there was a romantic rumor, she had to be there. Although part of her playful personality hid a great secret, it turns out she is half minus fairy, which partly granted her that great magical power. The thing is, thanks to that innate curiosity, she eagerly awaited days like these, where one of their own broke the mold and surprised everyone, like Professor duel who unexpectedly sided with the red ribbons. The thing is, while all the professors were having tea, Luna's name came up. She was a very powerful mage who competed with duel for the position of professor at the academy. But mysteriously, she withdrew from the competition. The thing is, she was a great mage, and if they offered her another position at the academy, she would surely return to the university. And here all these nobles are speaking in code, so I'll translate a bit. Duel had sided with the red ribbons. There was nothing wrong with that, but just in case, they should look for someone, given what could happen. Basically, they wanted to get rid of Professor duel and bring in a substitute. And all the professors insisted to Headmaster Adelaide, so she agreed to see what could be done. With them gone, the headmaster wonders what was going through duel's head, as even his exams this year had nothing to do with the previous ones. Luna was his arch-enemy in the past, and Adelaide wonders what will happen if they cross paths again. Without a doubt, something very fun would happen, and the headmaster couldn't wait to see it. In any case, a few days later, the exams arrived. All the students were very nervous, as duel's exams had a reputation for being impossible. Duel's assistant explains the rules, and it wouldn't be a simple exam at all. To begin with, the exams will last 10 days, and at midnight on the last day, the tests will end. To take the exam, each student will have a private room. They could leave it to rest or go to other exams. But the exams given in the room stayed in the room. These rules were already driving the students to despair. A 10-day exam was no joke, and on top of that, they were allowed to use textbooks and other materials. And if you've ever been a student, you know that an open-book exam is not fun at all. The exam would be tough, but duel left a reward for the best student. If anyone got a perfect score, he himself would recommend them as a great sage. All the mages at the university had only one thing on their minds: to become an arch-mage. Of course, becoming an arch-mage was not easy at all. Just to join, You had to climb certain levels that couldn't be surpassed with the power of magic alone. It wasn't an infallible system, but with these exams, they ensured that no dunce would become an arch-mage and cause a mess. So these exams were no joke. The professors had to be tough, and the students had to give it their all. If you reached mage level 4 and also got a recommendation from a head professor at the university, your life was practically set, and all you had left to do was keep climbing. And of course, getting a note from duel was a fabulous reward for everyone. But as soon as Luna heard it, all her energy vanished instantly. But wait a moment, Luna wasn't thinking it through. If by some miracle she got duel's note, she could advance much faster in magic, and then come back to duel and crush him as he deserves. And on top of that, she could mock him by saying it was thanks to his note. Luna is completely nuts, folks, and she's going to get the best grades in the class just to be able to mock duel. In fact, she could already imagine the outcome, with her at the top and Professor duel lying on the ground. Something that brought a macabre smile to Luna's face. But on the 4th day of exams, Luna was pulling her hair out, as the exams were really difficult. It was absolute madness, and there were questions that took Luna more than 10 hours to answer. Still, the exam was perfectly written, and you didn't have to overthink the questions to know what you had to answer. Understanding the questions was quite easy, but answering them was very different. In fact, these questions were so good that Luna highly doubted he made them himself. But she had to admit it. duel was very good, although in reality, she doesn't know they are her father's questions. In any case, the exam was very tough, and even with the help of textbooks, it was very difficult to answer anything. In the end, Luna was so overwhelmed that she decided to take a walk in the gardens. And there, Sylvia was resting in the shade. Her last exam question was brutal and took her more than 30 hours to answer, so she needed a break. She was curious about Professor duel's recommendation offer. Although for Sylvia, it was foolish. If you got a perfect score on this exam, you already proved your power and intelligence more than enough. So the professor's note was completely useless. Still, Sylvia wanted to get the maximum score. Not for the grades or the professor's letter, but to prove it to herself. This girl is so fake, seriously. I really dislike her. In any case, Sylvia was fascinated with duel's exam, as it overflowed with elegance everywhere. Besides, the final question was quite tough, and if Sylvia solved it, she was sure her magical power would grow immensely. And then out of nowhere Luna appeared with a curious expression. And at the same time, they both asked each other how many questions they had solved. It was so weird that they both got a little embarrassed. The thing is, Sylvia was on question number 8. Something that threw Luna off, as she was still stuck on question 7. But Sylvia didn't get flustered. After all, there was no way that useless girl could catch up to her at this point, so she just had to relax and complete her exam calmly, and certainly not worry about that useless girl. Meanwhile, all the students were applying themselves fully to their exams, and the protagonist saw the winds of change in the distance. And there were going to be changes indeed, as the game's story was about to move forward and the Empire's emperor was in his final days. Emperor Siribain was known for being good and gentle with all races. He always sought a balance between justice and the magical world, and for that reason he never touched other races under his protection. But as soon as he dies, all that will change abruptly, as the new king will be the complete opposite. His name was Sophien J. Ukayr Taugustus von Jebel. I'm not going to repeat that. And when he comes to power, the entire world will undergo a major change. But for now, the university exams continued, and many couldn't handle the pressure, so they simply gave up and left. The power difference between the students was very marked, and even those who failed took it as a badge of honor to have been able to take one of Professor duel's exams. This whole exam was causing a lot of buzz at the university, and even the other professors were curious about duel's exam. Although the most notable thing about the exam is that so far, only 2 students had reached the 8th question, Luna and Sylvia. That meant someone had finally passed the 8th question. duel went to visit her, and he always knew she would be the first to achieve it. After all, it was Sylvia, the number 1 in the class and the most powerful. Sylvia's room was filled with magic, but not normal magic. The magic was distorted and created vivid colors, and that was due to mixing cold magic with hot magic. Without a doubt, this was a masterpiece, and Professor duel was left speechless. The protagonist was the one who created these exam questions, but not even he was capable of reaching the same result as Sylvia. In fact, a curious thing, our protagonist had aspirations of being an artist in his youth. Wu Jin worked very hard towards his goal, but without talent, the only thing he could do was accept a job that at least had something to do with the field. The thing is, Wu Jin's feelings were merging with Deku Elian's aesthetics and stray. Because of this, both Deku Elian's soul and the protagonist were in sync, and they thought Sylvia's magic was beautiful. So Deku Elian congratulated Sylvia on her effort and also thanked her for showing him something so beautiful. Words that left Sylvia in shock. But as if nothing happened, Deku Elian disappeared. This saddened Sylvia quite a bit, as she would also like to thank her master. Ever since she can remember, she has been under high pressure to become an arch-mage. Her family's insistence was so great that Sylvia began to hate her own magic. But now Professor Deku Elian had shown her that her magic was very beautiful. But leaving Sylvia aside, Luna was not so lucky. The exam time was over, and she couldn't manage to pass the 8th question. At this point, Luna only had her own knowledge and really wanted to answer all the exam questions. So for Luna, it didn't matter that the exam was over. She had all the questions in her hands, so she would do her best to answer them all. And after another good chunk of hours, Luna left the exam rooms. Her fatigue was extreme, and she wished she could have answered all the questions in time. In any case, the exam was the least of her worries. She was a failure who took Professor Deku Elian's exam, so now only more abuse and insults from the high nobles awaited her. But then her dear friends appeared. Crushing and pure logic. Days later, Luna also managed to pass the 8th question. For her, it was fantastic. Unfortunately, she hadn't managed it in time. Still, she doesn't regret it. Apparently, Professor Deku Elian's exam was circulating everywhere, and the professors were very agitated. And even with all the scholars there, Professor Deku Elian's exam was on another level, and everyone was amazed by this new way of creating magic. At first, it was just talks between professors, but in the end, Deku Elian himself was invited to the floating island. And this came in handy for the protagonist, as soon as he received the news, he received a mission to go to the island. Once on the island, he was immediately put into a conference room, and of course, he was the star of the day. Before anything else, he introduces himself as Deku Elian, level for mage, etc., etc. And they were gathered there to analyze his exam questions in depth. To begin, Deku Elian starts by explaining what pure magic was and other related topics. Everyone paid attention, but some were not fooled. These questions in no way belonged to Deku Elian, and at the very least, they must have been plagiarized, which is true. The thing is, this girl here was Luna. The one we were told was Deku Elian's arch-mage rival, and she was not happy with him at all. The thing is, after a 2-our talk, everything went pretty well. Professor Deku Elian treated the other professors as if they were students, and thanks to that, everyone understood his concepts very well. Deku Elian was about to start explaining question number 6, but then Headmaster Adelaide wanted to ask something. She created some magic circles separating pure magic from normal magic and asked Professor Deku Elian how to fuse them with the magical principle of the 6th question. Deku Elian looks at the headmaster and isn't surprised at all to see her there. After all, she knew the original Deku Elian very well and surely believed he was still the same scammer as always. And in part, it's true, our protagonist is a great scammer, but he'll still give his headmaster a run for her money. So he took the headmaster's magic circle and just applied some slight changes. And of course, our protagonist, with all the calm in the world, answered each of her doubts with meticulous detail. In the end, the headmaster was making quite a scene in the room, so the other professors asked her to stop bothering them and to shut up for once, as Professor Deku Elian's explanations were very good and they didn't want to miss them. But in the end, there were only 10 minutes of the conference left, and thanks to the headmaster's questions, they didn't have time to solve the last question. And then Luna stood up, the protagonist's rival, and asked if he was sure that the method for question 8 was the correct one. The protagonist recognized her immediately, but not understanding her question, Deku Elian asked her to explain. And it was quite simple. Luna thought the 8th question was a plagiarism of someone else's work, and she even doubted that Deku Elian himself could perform it. Words that suddenly changed the atmosphere in the room. But Deku Elian doesn't back down and says that, as in all research, he was inspired by others to create his own, but he didn't copy anyone. But just in case, the protagonist flooded the room with powerful magic. He was applying the concept of the eighth question, and all that power was his and his alone. This magic wasn't as beautiful as Sylvia's, but it was enough for Luane to shut her mouth and quietly return to her seat. And with that, the conference was over, and Professor Dekuelian had received an extra 30 mana. And then the protagonist crossed paths with a woman in the middle of the hallways. Her face looked familiar, but he wasn't sure from where, and for some reason he looked at her with a disgusted expression. And what's her problem now? The protagonist wonders. And then he remembered who she was. It was Charlotte, an old classmate of Dekuelian's. Although, of course, she didn't consider Dekuelian her friend, not by a long shot. The thing is, pay close attention here, good info is coming. Whether Charlotte liked his face or not, the protagonist really didn't give a damn. What he did care about was Princess Mao, who was under her custody. As already mentioned, the Emperor was about to die. And when he does, there will be a real bloodbath among the high society. A game of life, blood, and bones, where many important characters will either get ahead or lose their lives. Her lineage was a big problem, and the shadow of a great war always loomed over her. The thing is, right now she was studying in the Empire, but when the Emperor dies, the nobles will go after her, and she will have a very hard time surviving. It was clear to Charlotte that Dekuelian knew her mission very well and that she was in a rather precarious situation, and she just hopes that Dekuelian isn't there to cause even more problems. But Dekuelian tells her to calm down and hands her a sphere. At that moment, Dekuelian swears to be the princess's savior and that no matter what, he will be there to save her from trouble. With those words, Dekuelian said goodbye to Charlotte. And she was left very confused, as that sphere was a communication sphere, just to alert the protagonist if she was in trouble. Of course, Charlotte didn't believe the protagonist at first. After all, she had already seen how he acted when they were in class together. But there was no time for nonsense. The princess was in trouble, and he could protect them both. But of course, if they didn't want help, to hell with them, says the protagonist. And he leaves, somewhat annoyed. Charlotte didn't know what to think of the situation. She was nervous about her future, but at least she had gained a few years living peacefully in the Empire, so she had no regrets. For now, they were still safe, but as soon as the Emperor dies, they must disappear from there as soon as possible. Mao saw her caretaker very distressed, so she approached her and handed her a suitcase with all her money. Charlotte was using her own money to keep the princess safe, and they would need money to hire guards or someone to protect them. Charlotte was not alone and could rely on her princess to move forward. Princess Mao trusted Charlotte blindly, so Charlotte had to reciprocate and will use all the money to hire powerful mercenaries. But then, Charlotte realized that someone was stalking them in the night. Charlotte confronted him, but the thug ran off into the shadows. The Emperor hadn't died yet, but the sewer rats were already making their moves. If Charlotte didn't get help, and fast, she feared the worst for her princess. And now we go with the protagonist to his house, where he was reading books nonstop, which amused his sister. As far as she knew, her brother didn't even know how to read until recently. The thing is, she found out that he gave a conference on the Magic Island and that he had been paid very well. And before she could continue talking, Dekuelian made it very clear that he wasn't going to give her a single cent, which was not his sister's intention, I think. Changing the subject, the people from the Magic University wanted to go to the Klein family's territory to study and take a break, something Dekuelian instantly forbade. He remembers student trips in his world very well, and there's no way in hell he's having drunk people running around his house. Something his sister had no idea about, but the thing is, Dekuelian wanted no part of it. Still, his sister insisted. But the protagonist suddenly gets serious and kicks his sister out. And he didn't do it gently. That expression really threw his sister off, and she reluctantly left Dekuelian alone. The protagonist didn't want to be rude to his sister, but he was just receiving a call from Charlotte. She was having a very hard time and really didn't know what to do. So she had no choice but to call Dekuelian and beg for his help. The protagonist will help her, of course, but it will be done his way, period. To begin with, the princess could only escape through one place, and it was a rather dangerous place. But for that same reason, they wouldn't look for her there. And the protagonist's plan was to use the Rift Canyon as an escape route. A place that didn't convince Charlotte at all, as it was filled with demonic energy, and without a doubt, Dekuelian was up to something dirty. But Dekuelian told her to shut up and in a kind and friendly manner, urged her to follow his plan to the letter and use the rift route. Anything else was walking towards death. The Rift Canyon route was not a pleasant place to go for a stroll. The demonic energy in the place was powerful, and it was even said that you could encounter real demons if you weren't careful. The good thing is that it was a neutral zone, and Charlotte, along with the princess, could cross it and thus reach the Republic of Hadak, where they would be safe. Of course, Dekuelian wouldn't leave them alone on such a tough journey, so he will be their guide. This made Charlotte suspicious, and she asked Dekuelian why he was helping them. And Dekuelian replied that he was somewhat interested in politics, and even if he explained it, since Charlotte was a bit of an idiot, she wouldn't understand anything. Obviously, Dekuelian wasn't doing this out of the noble goodness of his heart, but he hoped to profit from the princess in the future for his territory. But leaving all that aside, they will depart in 3 days. Until then, Charlotte and the princess will be alone. In the end, Charlotte accepted everything Dekuelian said and just hopes not to regret it later. The plan was set, and an exclusive mission for Dekuelian was also activated. 3 days later, we go to Hadak, the capital of the Klein family's territory. The city was majestic and served as a tourist center for high-class nobles. That's why Dekuelian's sister wanted the university students to go there on an excursion, but Dekuelian never accepted. However, now things were different, as the Rift Canyon was near that city, and that was perfect for the protagonist. Of course, he didn't waste time getting money from his students, so his sister was in charge of finding the VIPs and getting everything they had. After a few hours, Dekuelian guided the students through the place. They were on an excursion and were there to have fun, so Dekuelian wouldn't be on top of them all the time, and they could do what they wanted. However, he announces loudly and with a scowl that if he found even a single stain in his beloved hotel, he would make them clean it with their tongues. And he wasn't kidding. When night came, all the students gathered around a fire, where they launched fireworks into the skies. As always, Sylvia excelled in everything she did, and in all her practices, she got perfects or 10s, something that made Luna a bit self-conscious, as they were on vacation and still had to go through tests with scores. And on top of that, with the evil professors. It was then the commoners' turn. They tried to explain how they made their fireworks, as everyone else had done. But the professors told them to shut up and just finish the test quickly. Their fireworks exploded in the air, and similar to Sylvia's, they covered the entire night with beautiful lights. Even the other students were amazed by those fireworks. However, the professors didn't think the same, as those rockets made a lot of noise, so they gave them a 4. This made Julia erupt in fury, as it was not fair at all. But that was the life of the commoners, so they just had to endure it. Of course, Professor Dekuelian didn't take long to come to the rescue and gave the commoners a perfect score, as you'd have to be blind not to see that those fireworks were beautiful. This declaration left everyone speechless, especially Luna, who didn't know what Professor Dekuelian was thinking. In any case, hours later and in the moonlight, Dekuelian prepared to leave for the rift. Charlotte and the princess must be nearby, so the protagonist had to hurry. But then Luna appeared from behind, furious, and asked the professor if he felt sorry for her or something, or if he wanted to pay off some debt with her. Luna was tired of lies. The only clue she had about her father's death was Professor Dekuelian's abuse. She actually had no clues at all, and Luna asks if he was helping her out of remorse. Just to be clear, Dekuelian didn't like this conversation one bit, so he told Luna to just find out for herself. After all, she prided herself on being a strong and independent girl, so she should look for answers herself. But if Professor Dekuelian wanted to play hardball, Luna would too. So upon returning to the magic tower, she herself will ask to be the professor's assistant. When she is close to him, she will look for all the clues about her father's death, and sooner or later, she will unmask him as a villain in front of everyone. And above all else, no matter what it costs Luna, she will surpass him and trample over him. The thing is, not even Dekuelian himself knew what the original Dekuelian did to Luna's father, so if she found something, he would have no idea how to defend himself. And now that they've told us that, it's most likely that Dekuelian had nothing to do with his death. But anyway, we continue. In any case, Dekuelian continued on his way until his horse could go no further. And then, from around a dark corner, Charlotte appeared. She wasn't alone. Deku approaches Charlotte and the princess, and he formally introduces himself to them as Professor Deku, who will watch their backs on this terrible night. The princess was a little shy with him, but Charlotte tells her to trust Deku, as he was really strong. The princess's group was quite battered, and they also had a letter for Deku. It described what was about to happen that night, and Deku is not happy at all. This night would be truly eventful, so Deku asks for everyone's attention. They will set off at this very moment, and whoever falls behind will be left behind. And so, for several hours, they walked under the cover of the cold, dark night. Although Deku looked so grim that the princess asked about the letter's contents, and it was really something that would put anyone in a bad mood, as it described that 37 assassins, highly skilled in the dark arts, were after them. Oh, worse than them, Dianites were also coming, demonic beings similar to ghosts, and physical attacks were useless against them. Dianites by themselves were not a threat. The bad thing is that they were controlled by masters. The summoners of these creatures are called arch-mages, and they use the bodies of people and monsters to create their abominations. These people were really evil, the worst of the worst in this world. And if they managed to kill the princess, they would control a large part of the country. Luckily for them, they couldn't be in better hands. Remember that Deku belongs to the Yu-Klein family. And in case you didn't know, he's basically their specialist. In any case, after the march, they reached the Rift. The Rift Canyon, or the Somitas called Demon's Nest, a name that perfectly suited the place. The demonic energy was intense there, and because of it, the group could barely breathe properly. However, for Deku, it was the complete opposite, and his magic was even getting stronger. Thanks to the area's demonic power, Deku-Lian's body reacted continuously, and although a level increase of just 1 rank might seem small, there was a huge power difference between level 5 and level 4. The ranks of magic go from 1 to 10th. Most normal people had their rank at 10 or 9, and if you raised your rank to 7, you became a warrior or a mage. Mages with a rank higher than 5 are very rare in the world and quite powerful. And those in rank 3 or 4 were usually very strong and quite famous characters. Rank 1 was symbolic, something like the one who represented the god of magic. The thing is, now Deku was at rank 4, so any enemy that gets in his way will have a very hard time. As for Charlotte, she was complaining to Deku, as that place gave her the creeps. And for complaining, Deku calls her stupid. They were already going at a good pace, and if they rushed, something bad would surely happen to them. Besides, if they didn't properly control their surroundings, they could get poisoned by the environment. So Charlotte had to calm down and follow Deku without protesting much. Charlotte was just worried about the princess's safety, but even she asked Charlotte to calm down. Charlotte was clear if anything bad were to happen to the princess, she would pay for it with her own life. And that moment might come soon, as the princess let out a huge scream. It was because of a huge flock of dark and sinister bats. Fighting was inevitable, so Charlotte prepares for battle. But that wouldn't be necessary, as Deku will take care of everything. In an instant, numerous sharp stones levitated around Deku, and they were launched at the bats with great skill. The flying rats were small and agile, but against Deku-Lian's sharp, flying blades, they were nothing more than perfect targets. Deku-Lian eliminated the threat in a single blow without breaking a sweat. This amazed the rest, as while the pieces of bats were still falling from the sky, Deku-Lian was already marching forward. Although the bats were just the beginning, as they suddenly began to be attacked by numerous small enemies. They were all small and weak beasts, but they were so numerous that they made things difficult for the group. In the end, Deku-Lian got fed up with all the nonsense, and he certainly couldn't be a gentleman in the middle of the forest. So he raises his voice with great force and shouts for whoever is watching to come out immediately. And if they don't do it soon, he will find them himself and dismember them piece by piece. Charlotte and the princess are left speechless by this threat. And a thug who appears from behind a corner says that Deku-Lian has a lot of nerve. But now many bad people had gathered, and Deku-Lian's mouth would have to be quiet for a while. The group is completely surrounded by assassins, and Deku-Lian tells Charlotte to flee with the princess, something Charlotte didn't want to do. Deku-Lian appreciated Charlotte's concern for him, but the truth is, he didn't need it at all. Deku-Lian asked Charlotte to look at a bunch of bad guys on a hill, and then made them explode with a small spell. The assassins flew through the air, and the blood of hundreds rained down on the place. Behind them appeared a sinister being, one that emanated darkness from every pore of its body. That creature was a DIY-nite, a being that made Charlotte quite nervous. But for Destined, everything was still the same, so he tells Charlotte to get out of there. To calm the girls down, the other guy in the group, named Ron, offers to help Destined, although he still insisted he didn't need it. This would be their farewell, and if all went well, they would see each other again when the princess was safe. Charlotte felt bad for leaving everything to Destined, but in the end she had no choice but to grab the princess and run away. Of course, the assassins didn't stand still, and leaving the DIY-nite alone, they all went after the princess. And it seems Destined couldn't care less. At that moment, he was only thinking about killing that sinister shadow. Although the shadow was quite arrogant, as it knew it couldn't be eliminated by normal means. And in an area overflowing with demonic energy, it had the advantage. The shadow reveals some of its inner mana and felt extremely confident in defeating Destined. Although it probably could, as killing a DIY-nite is certainly not easy. Physical attacks were useless, and normal magic didn't work in that demonic place. But let's remember that Destined belongs to the noble Yu Klein family, and all his powers leveled up in this area. Besides, while they were walking through the place, Destined used his Midas touch on the stones and wood of the area, and thus, he created an arsenal of magic weapons. Both sides were ready to fight, and Destined was the first to attack with a sneak attack from the sky. The attack hit the shadow directly, which was completely decapitated. And if that wasn't enough, he split it in half with another frontal attack. It was a shadow, and no matter how torn apart it was, it could still fight back perfectly. Seeing the shadow in pieces, the warrior wanted to go and finish it off. But Destined tells him to stay back. Dianites weren't dead until you killed them, so you had to be very careful with them. What a bad line, oh my god. I'm not even going to fix it. The thing is, Destined didn't hold back, and with a flick of his wand, he levitated hundreds of sharp metal pieces. These trapped the shadow inside, leaving it at the center of a bloody vortex. The spectacle was atrocious, and the warrior is amazed by what he was seeing. But changing the scene, we go with Charlotte and the princess. After an arduous battle, Charlotte managed to eliminate all her pursuers. Although the escape was arduous, and due to the miasma of the rift, Princess Mao was exhausted. Exhaustion was the first sign of demonic energy poisoning, so the princess had to take it easy. Luckily, they had already crossed the forest, and on the other side of it, Mao's uncle made an appearance. Jillian, the Minister of the Interior of the Kingdom of Hadak. Uncle Jillian regrets leaving the princess alone on such a dangerous journey, but politics could be that cruel at times. Jillian thanks Charlotte for bringing the princess safely there, although she admits it wasn't thanks to her alone. So she looks back, hoping that Destined and the warrior would appear there. In fact, they waited for quite a long time, so long that night even fell. Princess Mao worries about Destined. But then, just as they were about to leave, Destined and the warrior Ron made their triumphant appearance. Destined only went there to confirm that the princess was safe, and since he had done so, he would return to his home. He didn't even wait for the princess's thanks or reward. He just turned around and walked away. Charlotte watches him in silence. And although at first, Destined seemed very hostile towards her, in the end he ended up shedding his blood for the princess's life. So for that very reason, Charlotte wanted to shake his hand and would like to thank Destined properly. Charlotte looks into Destined's eyes to thank her savior with a smile. Unfortunately for her, Charlotte was covered in mud and literally smelled like feces. So Destined didn't even want to look at her, much less get close to her. Without a doubt, Professor Destined was a vile, sharp-tongued villain. And just like a villain, Professor Destined left the place. Not without receiving thanks from the princess again. And Charlotte promises to compensate him in the future for everything he did. Something that didn't mean much to Destined, but it was enough for him to bid them farewell. And with that, the exclusive mission of crossing the rift came to an end. And Destined managed to obtain 4 coins and an extra 30 mana. Now we go to the mansion of Princess Mao's uncle, where Charlotte is called to his office late at night. She feared the worst and was sure that Uncle Jillian was plotting something bad against the princess. Princess Mao's life was truly difficult, and she couldn't even be safe near her family. But Jillian calmed Charlotte in hopes she would listen to his plan until the end. To summarize, the Grand Duke of the Kingdom wanted Princess Mao to support him with her reign. This leaves Charlotte quite shattered. If Mao did that, she could even become the Grand Duchess of the Kingdom. Apparently, the Grand Duke had a close grandson who was going to inherit everything, but he turned out to be disastrous and untrustworthy. So now the Grand Duke was seeking Mao's help. Of course, it was all a secret. And besides the two of them and the Grand Duke, nobody knew anything. Charlotte can't believe it. Just a few days ago, she was sure that Princess Mao would die miserably and with nothing. But suddenly, the opportunity of a lifetime fell into her lap, the chance to become a true ruler. Charlotte asks if anyone else knew about this plan, which was impossible as the Grand Duke had just given her the news in person a few hours ago. This puzzles Charlotte quite a bit, as Destined had told her several times that he would eventually profit from the princess. But at that moment, it was impossible for him to know she was going to be queen. Although Destined even told her clearly several times, when Princess Mao became ruler, Destined would collect his favor. Subtitles by the Amara, or community. Without a doubt, Destined seemed to know this would happen, but that was practically impossible, as it was as if he could see the future. She remembers when Destined called her a fool several times and that his plans were so wonderful that her sad little brain was incapable of understanding them. Without a doubt, Charlotte didn't like that monster Destined very much. But the thing is, he had saved her life and the princess's. So for now, she hoped that Destined had returned home safely. And he did. In fact, he got home before dawn. And although he only had 2 hours to sleep, he got up anyway. His talent, Iron Man, was very useful in these cases, as after activating it, all fatigue vanished instantly. At this point, Destined felt a bit like a monster. Uncertainly, the things he did sometimes pointed to that. But hey, that was the life of a forced villain. And like every morning, Destined trained his telekinesis. And thinking about everything he had achieved so far, he feels quite regretful. Since arriving in this world, he had been strict with himself, improving every day. He found his weaknesses little by little and corrected them with effort. Of course, all this hard work was due to Destined's different passives, like strong mind, useful habits, or competitive spirit. If he had all these things in his other world, it would have been great. In fact, we see some pieces of Destined's past, that is of Wu Jin. In them, his ex-girlfriend simply walked out the door, and Wu Jin didn't even dare to stop her. He was simply useless. And if only he had been as strong as Destined is, he could have kept his girlfriend with him. In fact, Destined would like to relax a bit and fool around. But due to all his passives, he had to be doing useful things for 22 hours a day, something that was starting to devastate him. But not at all. They were hiding from Professor Destined. Destined had changed a lot, but the girl, who is his ex-girlfriend, was his last request, one that was never fulfilled. So Ganesha fears that Destined, upon seeing the girl, will return to his bad habits. So she was avoiding him. But of course, Ganesha, after seeing how beautiful Destined looked, just feels like she wants him to kidnap her and lock her in a dungeon. Without a doubt, Ganesha was a rather disturbed girl. So Uriel gets fed up with her and continues on her way. And she did it right in Destined's path, just so he would see her. To Ganesha's surprise, Uriel froze. Uriel couldn't quite understand what was happening. But when she looked at Destined, she couldn't help but think of her ex-boyfriend Wu Jin. Memories with him flooded her mind. For 7 long years, they shared their lives, and both weren't really happy. But that was irrelevant, and Uriel wonders why she is remembering her ex-boyfriend right at this moment. It must just be a longing for a forgotten past. So slowly Uriel dried her delicate tears. The worst part is that Destined was experiencing the exact same thing as her, with the big difference that Destined was staring intently at a little girl. Creepy.